Hello, everyone, and welcome to Between Realities. This is Season 2, Episode 20, if you can believe that. I am joined here by my co-host, Skiva. Skiva, how the hell are you, sir?
I'm pretty good, man. I'm pretty good. I'm super excited for today's show. I'm excited to talk to Kent. I'm excited to give away a quest. Like, all this stuff. Super awesome.
Whoa. Can't yell that loud, all right? That your mic can't even handle that level of excitement, okay? Well, my name is Alex, by the way. I think I forgot to introduce myself. And hello to everyone who is joining us in the chat. Mateo311 here in spirit while he's doing his physical therapy today. Thanks for dropping in before you took off, dude. VR Central's here. How's it going, man? Matt Hoffman joining the Bearded Bard, who did VR Trend Magazine, which is extremely awesome. And I probably have to get Kent's thoughts on that. Desi Fox showed up. Limitless Gaming, of course, because he's always here, because he is the man. Dude, Limitless, thank you. Hello, Rebecca Evans, my friend, new fan of the show who has been showing up a lot lately, and we really appreciate your contributions to the community. Rebecca, Alt VR is here. The man Joachim. Who else we got, dude? We've got Dinah Gwen in the house. We've got Aaron Heidelbog in the house. I hope I got your name right. Who else we got, man?
Got everybody, man. All Andy you guys, Southern. Make sure you're subscribed, right? Because we're giving away a headset, and the description, the link should be in the description. I hope I put it in the description. Yes, it's in the description.
Brony, yep. Terrarian Brony and John Westra. Hello. Thank you guys for being here.
What's up?
It is a pleasure to have you here. This is a super exciting episode to be here for. We are indeed giving away a Quest 2. Skiva, give us a little bit of the story.
So we are giving away a Quest 2, as you can see here up on the screen, and we're going to be doing this through a Gleam giveaway. So go ahead and hop down into the Gleam link down in the chat, and it's just gonna bring you over to the University of Virginia's Reality Lab GitHub, because that's really what this is all promoting, right? These guys are doing awesome research. and we really want to help them grow their project. So, and plus we're here to kind of raise awareness as well for what you're kind of giving up as well when you do hop into a quest. So this is kind of like one of those weird situations where I'm like it's weird to give away a quest because I'm kind of and this anti-Facebook thing, right? But I love the quest, but I hate the company behind it. So it's like, I mean,
it's kind of like
buy one anyway.
A breaded and deep fried burger, you know what I mean?
Yes.
Like it ain't gonna be good for you, but we all bought it, and we're all having a good time consuming it, right now. So until we get our diets together, that's the only food we have available. So if you're hungry and you're interested in getting a Quest 2 for you or someone that this is your opportunity. This is probably your best freaking chance, to be honest, because the amount of people who are going to enter for this, slim to none is my guess. So get in on this and share it with people, because the other intention, of course, is to grow the Between Realities community. We're not going to lie. We are ready to have a massive audience. So share it with your friends and let's make this shit.
And we got to get people into VR, man. Like first and foremost, getting people into VR is the main thing for everything that we do.
Straight up.
Because I want full multiplayer lobbies. No, but for real, VR is amazing. So,
all right, listen, we have a super important person here with us, and we are not wasting any time. You guys already know who we have. Please welcome to the Between Realities spaceship, the legendary Kent Bai.
Hey.
What's up, Kent?
Hello. I almost talked over my camera. Hey, it's great to be here, Alex and Skiva. Thanks for having me back.
Absolutely. Dude, we are thrilled to have you, buddy.
We are so stoked to have you here. Your episode in our first season, in my opinion, look, when we started this, we wanted to have a VR podcast with a philosophical perspective, right? But it's hard to do that if we don't have someone like you come on our show, for real. So you, and for me anyway, really helped cement some of the stuff that we were trying to do, and I'm not sure that this podcast would be what it is without your visits, man. So thank you so much for your contributions to this community and to VR.
Yeah, and I just want to note that this past week I changed my bio from self-describing as a philosopher to an aspiring philosopher, and I just want to sort of disclose that my training is in electrical engineering, and I've always had a deep philosophical interest and drive, but as time has gone on, I've realized all the stuff that I don't know. So I'm in this state of epistemic humility around all of this stuff. But I think it's the philosophical questions that really drive me to do all the stuff that I do, just really searching for these deep, deep questions. And I think that it's nice to be able to just come talk about some of that more explicitly, because it's, I don't know, for me, it's such a motivating factor for why I do what I do.
I guess I'm going to have to find some extra characters in my bio to squeeze aspiring in there as well, because that's definitely how I feel, But at some point along the line, you kind of realize that it's philosophy, that deep yearning question that was itching, that thing that kept me up at night, even when I was a kid and into my adulthood. When I eventually took some college courses, I realized there was a name for studying that, and that was philosophy. Do you think that philosophy, at its core, is something that can you can train someone to think philosophically? Do you think it's something that's innate and is kind of within you, and how do you define philosophy for yourself?
Well, philosophy is weird because a lot of times there's never really any final answer. And there's sort of long debates within philosophy as to whether or not we've even had any progress in philosophy since the time of Plato. Maybe they just sort of figured it all out at the very beginning, and that everything else is just we're spinning in circles, because there's there's so much of it that is we can't really ever know. That's what makes it philosophical. Is that there's no, if we could know, there'd be science. There'd be something else. It wouldn't be the philosophy. So to me, there's something about the frontiers of not knowing, and based upon your metaphysical assumptions, you can actually get different answers. And one of the favorite stories that I have around that is from Gödel. Gödel wanted to, in some ways, he wanted to prove that there was God, and he used logic to do it, and that really inspired him to do this incompleteness theorem. And the way he's a Platonist, meaning that he kind of believed that there was this eternal realm of ideal forms, and that a lot of mathematical objects were kind of coming from those ideal realm and somehow interfacing with reality. The nature of math and math objects and how they're related to reality is one of the most profound mysteries of all of math or all of philosophy, because it's like, why does that work? Why does some sort of axiom that we come up to like 13 decimal points of precision when it comes to like quantum electrodynamics? It's like baffling for why math has its relationship to reality. And so
Hmm.
he wanted to, really show that, well, maybe he could in some ways kind of disprove the logicians in order to prove that you could, like, whatever set of logic you use, you're going to have a certain lens into reality. So given another lens, you're going to get new insights that you can't see. It's almost like the complementary nature of matter. It's like the wave particle duality, which some folks think that it collapses, some folks think it doesn't. But I'm on the camp that says that it does collapse. So let's assume it collapses. If it does collapse, it means that this entity is either a wave or a particle, and it's both at the same time. It's happening, and it's like a paradox.
Hmm.
I think that's the nature of reality itself. Is that the essence of both being true, depending on how you look at it.
Right.
Yeah,
I
and we
I
kind of
agree.
saw that with like the double slit experiment, right? Where if things are being observed, they change in real time. At least, that's one of the theories of why that's happening.
Yeah, there's the math is clear as to what's happening with the
Mm.
double slit. I mean, quantum mechanics is like the most verified scientific theory we have ever. It's just more of like the story for what the nature of reality even is.
Right.
Mhm.
That sort of creates this parsimonious like explanation that is both at the same time explanatory but also intuitive at an embodied level. And it's that lack of embodied intuition around it that makes a lot of folks say like it's so complicated we can't even figure it out. But
Right.
there are
Yeah.
some approaches that I'm drawn to of like folks like Alfred North Whitehead that takes this kind of like completely different approach of seeing the nature of reality as these little bits of experience or processes that are unfolding. It's very similar to like Chinese philosophy that sees things that are always in these dynamic flux and changing, and always at any moment, moving from one state to the next. And the language of what we have here in the West uses what is like subject predicate. So we always have an object and an entity, and there's like the language that we have puts us into this mindset of these fixed static objects. And I think that part of what VR was so exciting for me is that it gives people this direct embodied experience that's something that different than sort of like this materialist worldview. I mean, you could still explain everything away as things being neurons firing, and it's just consciousness is a epiphenomena of our neurological, correlates that are matched up to our and everything of base reality is physicality. But Whitehead goes as a completely different direction and say, no, I don't think that when you get down to the quantum level, there's really no there. There's no object. It's just patterns of energy in relationship to each other.
Mhm.
And he
Hmm.
kind of took that to an extreme and said, okay, well, maybe all of reality is just based upon these processes rather than these fixed static objects. And I think that alone, it has so many different metaphysical implications in terms of how you perceive so many different things. And for me, it's
Well,
giving me this huge insight into the nature of VR.
you compared that to, like what I was see, like when you were explaining the previous perspective, it was kind of like that, like dualistic, like paradoxical kind of thing, right? And like in my mind, I was thinking about like Chinese philosophy with like the yin and the yang. You know what I mean? And I've heard you talk about the yin and the yang in talks before, but you brought it up when you started talking about like a separate perspective of the process philosophy of like a bunch of single moments that as people, or as consciousness or whatever you want to define the experience that we're having right now, it's like little moments that you're like are like feeding into each other and like the playing out of things, so is is there like a space for that like aspect of duality in both of these perspectives then?
Well, the way I like to think about it is like each of these philosophies are like lenses into reality, and they reveal things that other ones can't see. And I'll give you an example here relative to like Chinese philosophy. So, let's say you go to a Chinese doctor and you have some symptoms. Well, if you go to that doctor in the summertime and say the exact same thing as you go to them in the wintertime and say the exact same thing, they may actually give you a different treatment based upon the relative, relational dynamics with what's happening in the seasons and the rest of the world. So there's like this ecological perspective that I think is lost when it comes to reductive materialism, which is trying to like reduce things down to these component parts and kind of get as boiled down as you can. But when you do that, it's revealing some things, but you're also missing that collective picture. So as you narrow down into the small, you miss the large. And so I think, a lot of ways that's why I turn towards this kind of pluralistic approach, which is like, well, if you really dig down deep, you'll get some insight, but it won't be everything. It won't be complete.
Hmm.
That's
So
the
by
vertical integration
ecological, you
concept.
mean like the like brick and mortar like like stuff, or like the things that are like easily measurable. Am I
Well,
correct?
the ecological aspect is more of the relationships, the relational dynamics. And so you as a human being are in relationship with what's happening on. They pay attention to that. They pay attention to the seasons. They pay attention to all these other aspects of what's happening in your life. A lot of naturopaths and stuff do that too, where they ask you a lot of questions about what's happening in your emotional life, for example. Whereas
Hmm.
maybe a Western trained doctor is not going to like do like psychotherapy or depth psychology with you in a doctor office. They're just going to look at the symptoms and then like try to get rid of those symptoms. And so, but if like I get a very severe injury and I need to get immediate attention, I would go to a Western doctor. But if there's like chronic issues that I'm facing, then maybe the Chinese perspective may have a completely different orientation, which have like five element, like the way that they conceive about the different five elements and how
Hmm.
like how those are related. But I think the key difference is the relationality for how you as an individual are in relationship to the world outside of you. And
What do you
that's a lot of
think?
what Whitehead is putting forth in his process philosophy is saying that we are fundamentally interconnected in all these different, like fundamental ways in terms of at the quantum level, we're connected, we're embedded, we're entangled, in sort of at higher levels of the complexity. So, yeah, I think both Chinese philosophy and process philosophy has that ecological relational perspective, whereas the more reductive approach doesn't necessarily always see that.
Hmm.
Hmm. Yeah. This is
Okay.
oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, I kind of want you to just continue because I feel like I understand where you're going with this, and this is a VR podcast after all. So
Yeah.
you often talk about how VR to you represents a paradigm shift, and
Yes.
I think it would be good to start by what do you even mean by this represents a paradigm shift? Because there's a lot of folks who probably have, don't talk about this kind of thing. So what does it mean to say that VR represents a paradigm shift? And then how can we apply what we just learned? Like how can we now that we're armed with this knowledge about like Whitehead's philosophy and your perspective of process philosophy, how can we apply what you now are perceiving about VR's role in this?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of people, when they have a VR experience, it's in some ways like an undeniable phenomenological experience where we're given an experience that is matching other memories that we have in our lives. And we're faced with this dilemma. Like, we have this even virtual reality as a word is sort of creating this bifurcation of reality and not reality. This is a special type of reality. It's virtual reality. And in some ways that's a misnomer because it could be that it's just as real, perhaps it's even more real. Like imagine a situation where we're able to get deeper connected to the essence of reality in VR than we are in reality. Because we can train our brain to be able to see patterns and maybe we'll be able to see a virtual representation of the underlying fabric of reality. And we'll be able to like train ourselves to be able to perceive that. And we're able to unlock these latent human potentials that we never even knew were possible before. And so I think that's like that type of potential for we're here in 2020, maybe by 2025, somebody will like figure out like how to unlock our consciousness to be able to like dip straight into like a samadhi experience, like this sort of nirvana experiences where meditators have to like spend decades like cultivating a very finely tuned process to be able to get to these states to achieve these states of consciousness. And so what if that we're able to use VR to be able to like fast track ourselves and there's going to be things that are gained and things that are lost in doing that. But I think that overall we have this like normally our subjective experiences are very ephemeral and very context dependent and non-repeatable. But you can like give, I can give you an experience of Star Wars Galaxy Edge. I can give uh, Skiva, I can give you the same experience, and then you could have, in some sense, the same subjective, or the same objective input that's usually too complicated to ever standardize. So you're able to now you start to compare your phenomenological experiences together, and you're able to cultivate the language around that. So I think part of what VR is doing is that it's encouraging us to develop that language for how do we talk about our interior life, and how do we compare it, and how do we see all these different ways that VR is able to modulate our experiences, um, in ways that are universal experiences. You know,
Mhm.
when I did Beat Saber, I was like, oh my god, this is amazing. It'd be good exercise for people to go back and listen to the very first conversation I did with the developers of Beat Saber. I was like, oh my god, that was incredible. You know, and to see how much Beat Saber has taken off, then there's this calibration process that everybody has to go through between what you see as an individual, but versus what people as a collective experience. And this is sort of the challenge of aesthetics and all art, which is like, you know, what do you think about something? What did you think about that movie? What do you think about that piece of art? But here we're starting to get to more of the core mechanics of our perception and our bodies. And I think that because phenomenological input and subjectivity have been so problematic in the past, they've been really ignored. And so, what's it mean to really have a science that is integrating our subjective input? And that's what's called neurophenomenology. So, being able to like trace the neurological correlates, but also to take these first person perspectives. And a lot of times, there's a good example for why it's like you have something that happened to you, and then you ask, well, why did you do that? And then you give an answer and you think that's the story for why you did that, but in actuality there's like neuroscience evidence that shows that actually whatever triggered this happened way before you were even consciously aware.
Right.
And then like you do something and then you kind of project your story on top of it. So our subjectivity is like so wrought with all these, you know, kind of nuances of human perception that are not perfect. And so scientists have just taken all of that subjective input and they just kind of thrown it out. They threw the baby out with the bathwater. So we're kind of in this realm of like, what's it mean now to like have a science that is trying to like be more whole and try to integrate these subjective perceptions? And so like that process, as well as, you know, trying to integrate all these things together, requires these more holistic perspectives, which is, you know, you go back to Whitehead where you start to see how things are related to each other. And then from there, you start to, you know, what I'd say in terms of like we're in a crisis right now in terms of the earth is we're destroying the earth by not being in relationship, and we're not being in right relationship, and we have all this fossil fuel and global warming, and we have COVID right now, and we're like dealing with a lot of issues with like locking down. But this is sort of like the sneak peek for what life could be like when global warming kind of goes out of control. So it's kind of like the way that we've been kind of sleepwalking into this, you know, not really being paying attention to, because there's nothing that's immediate that's giving us a feedback to see like, oh, if I do this action, this is how this is related into the wide world. And so that's another part of like seeing how your small interactions kind of fit into a larger story of the ecosystem, and how we're either being good stewards of that ecosystem or we're helping to, you know, kind of be predatory in some ways, and not be in right relationship with the world around us. And I think that VR has the power to be able to help not only tell those stories, but help us connect us deeper to the world around us. And that's what like Jaron Lanier always says, is that the real VR experience happens when you take off the VR headset, because you go into VR, it's basically rewiring your perceptual input so that when you take the headset off, you literally see the world in a new way.
Mhm.
And like to be able to take that to the extreme, we're like, of all the things that are happening in the world right now, we have like this crisis of consciousness where we have these different filter bubbles of reality, where we have one reality on one side, another reality on another side. And those two realities are at an impasse where we're in the middle of a global pandemic where there's a bit of an ethical dilemma in terms of if one side who's saying is a hoax is wrong, then they could actually be causing people to die. And if
Right.
people who are saying that, no, this is real and there's an abundance of caution, there's maybe a short term impact on the economy, which has a long term impact, which is another sort of moral dilemma of like, we don't want to shut everything down. We want to still have people engaged in the world. We also want to have people do the basic practices that they need to do with masks. And if everybody just wore the masks and like stayed out of the situations and social distance, we'd be fine. But we have like these reality bubbles that people like think that their personal liberties are more important to be expressed, which means that, well, and I'll sort of take a step of epistemic humility where I don't know, like maybe they're right. Maybe it is all a hoax. Like
Right.
I'll sort of save a little part of my mind with that. But I really believe that morally, it's a utilitarian argument to say, actually, you could be doing more harm to people by believing it's a hoax. And if you're wrong, you could be killing people. And if you're right, then you have an abundance of caution and you're keeping people safe either way.
Hmm.
So it's like stuff like that where we're in a world where we have to recognize that yes, we want to be autonomous individuals with liberties, but we also
Hmm.
have to recognize that we're not islands, we're not isolated. This sense of self is in some sense an illusion because we are fundamentally interconnected with even the language we're speaking doesn't come from us. It comes from a culture. It comes from what does it mean to be with other people. And so there's this deeper aspect of seeing how we need to be in relationship to the world around us that I think that I hope that VR could perhaps start to teach us.
Yeah,
You know,
I was thinking that VR in general is a great way for people to socialize, and well, obviously for people to socialize and to see other people without putting anyone in danger, without having to wear a face mask. You have to wear an eye mask, but like, being able to hang out, get as close as you want, be able to talk to people without any of that danger. It kind of eliminates the whole thing. And I feel like this pandemic is an amazing reason why we should be gravitating towards spatial computing. At least that's what I believe. There's just there's so many benefits and so few cons to the whole thing,
well,
right?
to
Being
me,
able
that
to,
this is just like, like this is almost that's just like it's like the practice is like a means to an end that it's almost like hidden. It's like a secret thing that's going to be happening. It's almost like by
Mhm.
doing a martial arts practice, you're sure you're doing martial arts, you're learning how to fight, but in reality, it's actually about the connection to the higher thing. So like these people will be pulled into these virtual worlds almost as a maybe necessity, to cope with living in the world of a pandemic or something. And in turn, maybe will find themselves, for a lack of a better way to put it right now. Like I think what Kent's talking about is like before, in order to like understand some of these like deeper meanings of connection and stuff like that, you have to go some pretty unconventional or certainly unwestern routes to get there. Like he
Yeah,
said,
yeah,
a lot of meditation before ding, the light turns on
yeah.
and you're connected with the world. Or if you're like us and you do mushrooms or acid or something like that. And I mean, there's a time when I did mushrooms and I was watching TV and I saw a commercial for a zoo and I realized how fucked up zoos were. Like
Hmm.
that's a level of connection to the understanding of those species and the planet that I don't normally have when I'm just like chilling. I'm just watching TV. I'm like, oh, sweet, a zoo. You want to go? I don't know. Next channel. But
Yeah.
like when you're on mushrooms and you're thinking about it, you're connecting it's in a completely different way. And I find it so interesting that I've had experiences on hallucinogenics where I've been in a group of people and everyone there swears we are riding the same wave, experiencing very similar things. We're all like looking at each other like
Hmm.
mind blown that this shit is going on.
Yeah.
And that's a phenomenological experience. When he talks about phenomenological experience, it's like this thing that is fucking true and real, right? Like you had this experience. And, like DMT users, how they all come back talking about machine elves and shit, like they all say this, no, this is a place I went, but it's intangible and it's not something measurable. It's certainly not something that like, we can just like go around giving to everyone, and wouldn't it be amazing if somehow, and maybe you can tell us how this could possibly happen, Kent, how the hell can a glowing like light box on your head get it done, you
and
know
and and will things like Neuralink and brain interface in computers, will that help us to see kind of that reality? Would it bring us closer together because we'd all kind of be on the same brainwave internet, or would it pull us further apart because then we're further separated from nature, from animals, from the planet itself? I don't know, you can see it going both ways.
Well, something like Neuralink, I think that they're going to start with people who have really bad neurodegenerative diseases,
Mhm.
and they're going to see if whatever they end up doing, some sort of intervention, this invasive, BCI or these chips in your brain, and if they're able to bring a better life for those people, then that's great. I'm all for doing that. I think the area where I get a little bit more hesitant or skeptical is that, like, our perceptual input has, like, all of our ways of taking in input of the world has been evolving for like billions of years essentially. And like it's very refined. And so now we're going to essentially bypass and hack that system. And like the amount of unintended consequences for what that means to kind of like dip into our wetware and start to send messages and signals directly in there. And I think for me, it's a bit of like, well, the way that we understand reality is through what in the neuroscience is called embodied cognition. It's more of a process relational approach. It's like your entire body is a part of understanding the nature of reality. So, what does it mean to sort of hack directly into the brain and sort of bypass all those aspects of your motor cortex? I mean, at some point, you are sort of building up all these memories and associations in your brain. And so, as an example, when I say the word kick, the parts of your brain that are activated are actually the part of your brain that actually kind of would kick actually your foot out. So like there's a way in which the language is actually activating the motor cortex in a way that is imagining the language. And so there's parts where all of this stuff is connected together. So what does it mean when you start to like just kind of hack into it and try to, you know, hack into the matrix, as it were, and sort of send signals directly into your brain? And this is probably the most pertinent to things like smell and taste, because I don't see a good roadmap for how we're going to get reasonable smell and taste into these virtual experiences. And it may need something like a direct neural interface to be able to get that. And there's ways in which that there's brain control interfaces that are non-invasive that you put on your head, and it's able to like basically essentially like get enough information, and with enough machine learning over time. There's this thing called speech synthesis, which came out from UCSF back in like April of 2019. And speech synthesis is essentially you put this thing on your brain. They've done all this neural network. Well, actually, it's ECOG. So it's actually for people who have some sort of condition where they would need to have neurons in their brain, and maybe they can't speak or they're paralyzed or whatever else. They're able to like listen to someone thinking, and then as they're thinking, all those signals are interpreted and then put into this machine algorithm translation, and then it literally spits out a waveform. So it's a literal mind reader. It's this device that can read your mind. And when I talked to a neuroscientist at the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research, it was a future of VR and neuroscience symposium that I went to back last year. One of these experts was like, within the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to be able to do this with non-invasive technology, and eventually move from speech into images, into dream, like essentially your dreams. So imagine having a neural interface where you're able to just imagine something, and your imagination is manifest into a virtual world that other people can experience. It's literally like walking into someone's
Isn't
lucid
that kind of
dream.
what the real world is?
Well, it's arguable as to whether or not the realism exists. It's so, Catholicism is that we all sort of exist in our own sort of consciousness reality. The nature of consciousness itself is sort of an open question as to like what actually is happening at this core
Mhm.
fabric. But you know, yeah, are we in one cosmic dream or something like that, or in God's dream? Are we in a simulation? Lots of different philosophy of minds, and none of them you could really prove one way or another. It'd always be sort of speculative. So,
Mhm.
it's I have my own sort of personal favorite with those, but yeah, I think
Do you think that there is one? Like, do you think that like someone's right?
um I think that the physicalism, the one that we've been sort of in for a long, long time, so the last 100 years or so, it's kind of reaching its logical extreme in terms of how useful it is. I think it starts to do more harm than good, because if you just take it as a metaphor of like, if you're looking this way, you can see some stuff, but you're looking the other way, you can see some other stuff. It's almost like you refuse to turn around and look what's in the other direction.
Mhm.
And because if you dig down deep enough into some of the metaphysical assumptions, there's like you can get down to the point where you can essentially argue for any of them: idealism or dualism or panpsychism or constituents of panpsychism.
Is
Or
that not the allegory of the cave that you just
yeah,
described?
yeah. Well, that's the Plato's allegory they gave, is that, the thing that we're seeing in reality is just like these mere shadows, and that like there's this platonic realm of ideal forms where everything is sort of in this idealized form, and everything that we're seeing and perceiving is just sort of like an artifact of something that we're not experiencing the core truth of
Right.
it. We're just seeing a reflection, and that you know the deeper you dig into like the holographic universe and everything else, there is an evolutionary point where we stop looking at things that are at that quantum noise level. We haven't been we've been needing to like figure out if like a tiger is going to come kill us, and that's a different
Right.
algorithm than whether or not we need to sort of pay attention to the subtle quantum noise of the fabric of the universe. That's you can't necessarily perceive that, but with VR, maybe we can train ourselves to see that, and maybe we might be able to get some new insights. But I think the point is that I as the more that I've dug into all of this stuff, the more that I am convinced that any sort of deeply philosophical venture is going to have somebody that, if you really want to like take a philosophical approach, you should be able to argue for and against every single perspective and understand the trade-offs that you have for each of those. And I think that's sort of like it's it's a never-ending venture. But I think most philosophers end up having like a center of gravity where they're just like, oh no, we're an analytic tradition, and like there's all these fixed objects, and substance metaphysics is definitely the thing, and there's all these properties, and they sort of add all this language and everything on top of it, when it could be that their core metaphysical assumption of substance metaphysics is completely wrong, or is useful in some context, but in other contexts it isn't helpful at all. It's
Mhm.
actually more harmful. So I think that's when you look at math is like so mysterious, and there's some like weird things of like the foundations of math are also kind of like no one is there's not a group consensus where everybody agrees for why math even works, which is like, okay, that's interesting. We have all this math, and like the core foundations are just sort of still somewhat unsettled, or and but it still works. And so you have all these mathematicians that end up being like these functional pluralists, where they're like, well, we know that this works in this context, and this works in this context, and this works in this context. But they know that, like, to know what the true answer, when you talk to mathematicians, they're like, okay, is it a platonic realm of ideal forms that we have, and is this mathematical platonism a real thing, or is it nominalism? Is it all just language games? Is it just descriptions that
Mhm.
we have? Is everything just like a naturalistic physical world, and we're just seeing like an equivalent of like a chess game, and these are the rules of the game, and within the context of those rules, then these are the stories that happen, but it's just a game. It's not like that any sort of deeper ontological connection to reality. It's just like a language game. So is it a language game, or is there something that's a deeper math reality of like this platonic realm of ideal forms? And you ask like the mathematicians, okay, if you believe one or the other, what's it matter? And they're like, nothing at all. It changes absolutely nothing of
Right.
anything I ever do, anything in math, except for a few sort of edge cases in set theory or whatever else. There's some like small areas where it does make a difference, whatever your assumption is. But for most of the time, it doesn't matter. So then the question is, then why is it important to look at it all? If it doesn't matter for most use cases of math, then why is it important to even look at the philosophy of math? And this was a question that was like very intriguing to me, because there are some people that are like really interested in the philosophy of math. And I think the answer that I got from these mathematicians is that the people that are interested in the philosophy of math are the same type of people who are interested in philosophy in general. They just want to ask these deep questions. And for people like Gödel, he made a metaphysical assumption about Platonism, and it led him to the incompleteness theorem. For people who were not Platonists, they would have never ever thought to even look there. It's like you think of it as like a spotlight. Like your metaphysical assumptions are like a spotlight where you're looking for something. And for some people, they're like, why are you looking there? There's nothing there. And then you're like, no, but I really believe it. And then they find something. And then they're like, see, there was something there. And I think
Mhm.
that sort of insight of like, wow, like you could just sort of try in all sorts of different perspectives, and who knows what you'll be able to be able to discover. And I think that's why I take such a pluralistic approach, because it's like everybody in the world has some sort of thing that they're able to like see the world and discover something that no one else in the world can understand or see. And then like it's like a grand challenge to be able to like, well, how do we get everybody to come together and like get the
Right.
little puzzle piece that they have to be able to unlock the secrets of the universe?
Mm,
You know,
that
science is like the direct practical, like, science tries. so hard, right? Like that's what science ultimately is trying to do. Like, we see science come up in pretty much every aspect of our lives, but I would say, initially, like I would argue, I don't know, I would say that the objective of science is to determine what the hell is going on, right? Which is almost in the same objective of philosophy. Am I right? Or
Well,
would you?
what I would say is that science would not exist without philosophy because
Right.
there is a philosophy of science. And these questions of truth and knowledge and epistemology go back to the beginning of philosophy. And
Well,
so,
and I always call science like the religion of naming shit, because like we name everything, right? Like we're observing the universe and we are like drawing these relationships between two things, right? But like I talk about like size as an example, right? Like the relativity of size. Like something is not big until it is compared to something else, right? Only when it's next to something else is it big or small, but otherwise, its size inherently, I don't think is not defined at all by, it's not a part of its definition, you know? And science, like, it has an explanation for everything. Like you could talk about like, oh, like, where did this scab come from? And it's like, oh, wow, there's all these, white blood cells that come rushing, and they react to the platelets come out. And like white blood cell and platelet are just names that we've given to things and then created relationships between the two of them. But do you think that we're any closer to actually knowing the nature of it, by doing scientific research like that?
well, there's two questions there. One is around science and the nature of knowledge and truth and epistemology, and then the fundamental nature of reality itself, which I think is perhaps beyond what science can ultimately ever figure out. But I'll take the one about science first because I think there's an important point that I want to make here. Last year, when I was traveling to Amsterdam, I was like watching this video of Philosophy Overdose is a YouTube channel, and this 5 minute and 54-second video of Agnes Callard comes on, and it was like what she like the real innovations from Socrates, and it was like this like thing that like incepted my brain, and I have not been able to stop thinking about it. I've almost like referenced that video almost every day for the past year. And here's why. Here's the insight she has. She says, the innovation of Socrates is that he kind of figured out this dialectical process. You kind of like get into the Socratic method is like Socrates was always questioning and asking questions. And so like there's this process of people kind of talking back and forth with each other to figure stuff out. And she's like, what is it about that like, was that a process? And she's
Mm.
like, she does think that it is a process. And the process is that she sort of figures out, eventually gets to the point where she says the process of knowing is actually two algorithms that are actually mutually exclusive to some extent. Like it's hard to do these two algorithms at the same time. And those two algorithms are believing truths and avoiding falsehoods. Like you have to know something is true and you have to believe that it's true, but you have to kind of take a leap of logic, an inductive leap of belief. You have to have the will to believe, as William James had said. But then, there's the believing falsehoods. And so, how do you avoid believing falsehoods? If you want to get some knowledge, you have to believe the truths and avoid the falsehoods and like disprove them. So, how do you do that when they seem to be the same thing, but they're actually different? Because, like, avoiding falsehoods, if you wanted to always avoid all falsehoods, you'd be just like this ironic skeptic where you wouldn't believe anything. You'd just be like, nope, yeah, this would be the worst thing in the world to believe anything that's like false. And
There's a
be
lot
like
of
a
them out
general
there.
who never sends their soldiers in the army because it might not be correct. So there's this, and the solution is what ends up happening in both what we have with justice and truth and the also the peer reviewed process. So kind of break that down. What she says is that in order to find the truth, what you need to have is like one side take one position, the other side take the other position, and you have some sort of deliberative process where you're collaborating towards truth and justice. And then at some point, you're able to sort of transcend the limitations of each of your perspective to the point where you get to some sort of what you can say truth, where you have what's essentially the peer review process, where you have a hypothesis, you put it out there, but yet, it has to be peer reviewed. People have to kind of really try to tear it down and like see, is this going to actually hold up? And is there anything that you missed? And is there anything that's wrong with your methodology? Or can we even like replicate this? And so then science and knowledge takes time of like this process of like putting out things like, I believe that this is true. This is a hypothesis. We proved it with this sort of experiment. And they're like, I don't know. Let's really test it. And that's the that's the scientists who are real scientists have that humility of like, they're like really hesitant until it's been through that full process of being vetted, because they may have they may have falsehoods that they're believing that they don't know, and they need to have other people to point them out. And if you look at justice, it's very similar too, because it's like in justice, you have a court, you have someone who's the prosecution and the defense. It's two separate teams, and they're collaborating towards justice together with a jury that's deliberating and a judge that's sort of overseeing it as well. And it's that dialectical process of what we were talking about before. It's almost like the complementary nature of reality itself, where it's impossible to have the full picture by yourself. And that's why I'm lean again towards this process philosophy, because it's like really to have any knowledge or any ideas at all, you have to have this collaborative, deliberative process. It's a dialectical process where you're like, like Socrates was like, well, what about this? Or what about this? And it's that collaboration. And that's the key. The collaboration means that you have to be willing to sit in the paradox of not knowing, like in order to like have this real true dialectic with
Why aren't
the-
people? Why do so many people identify with their perspective? Like it defines them. It's like, this is me.
well, I think that people, they have a will to believe and they want to believe and they have enough evidence, but it could be for confirmation bias or whatever else. But it's also like, to go through a huge paradigm shift actually is like, it's pretty traumatic for some people to actually have their worldviews torn apart. Now, when when you become a philosopher, it almost becomes like fun to be like, oh my god, what's like antinatalism? What's like this idea that sounds ridiculous, but let me hear like an argument, and then you hear the argument. It's like, oh yeah, actually, you could like make a strong argument that no one should like have children. Antinatalist perspective that so it's like things where for philosophers, they can, or people who are philosophically inclined, like myself, or who aspire into this being a philosopher, your mind gets tickled in this novelty of like being willing to sort of slip into another reality bubble. And I think that's like in some ways when you go into VR, you slip into reality bubbles. Well, philosophy is all about like reality bubbles because it's all about having these sets of assumptions that lead into a whole world. So there's a certain aspect of philosophy that's a process of world building. And for some people, that's just very traumatic because it means that they have to reevaluate everything in their life that they are built. It's like it's like ripping out someone's foundation
Yeah.
of a house.
And
now they have
it's a mountain that they've been standing on for 20, 30, 40 years. Like a lot of people build their lives around the idea that they have identified themselves around. And in order to to learn anything new, they would have to first be willing to, for all intents and purposes, kill themselves. Because otherwise, what are they going to throw away the platform that they've built for the past 20 or 30 years? You know what I mean?
Well, this is what Thomas Kuhn did with the structure of scientific revolutions. So this is a huge like sort of breakthrough in the philosophy of science, and more along the lines of the sociology of science. And what Kuhn was able to show is that it's not about like the data, the raw data. It's actually like a sociological process of people who don't want to change their mind. They're so fixed into their worldview that it. And so what he mapped out in this sort of structure of scientific revolutions is that you have a set of theories, a model, right? And then you have what he calls the anomalous data. It's data that you're able to verify in some ways that is anomalous. It doesn't fit your model. Your model's wrong. It's deviated from being able to describe reality. So there's one of two options you can do at this point. You can either consider a new model, or you can say that anomalous data is not representative. I'm just going to ignore that data. That's essentially what happens. You have all this anomalous data that's coming up all the time, and people are sort of like, no, I'm really happy with my worldview. I'm going to just completely reject that. And so that's the essence of a paradigm shift, is when there becomes a new model that describes the nature of reality better than the previous one. But it's not just that it describes it better. You have to have a critical mass of people believe it, because you have, and that's a lot of people talk about, like paradigm shifts happen when a lot of the old people who are the old guard, they literally die.
Right. Collective consciousness is what comes to mind for me. This sounds like you're talking about collective consciousness in a way.
Collective, there's a sort of whole area of, collective consciousness from a Jungian perspective, the collective unconscious. There's Rupert Sheldrake's a conceptualization of collective consciousness. There's more of the Jungian approach, which is more of like a symbolic realm of those realities. And whether or not there is an actual collective consciousness or not. You could just say from a purely naturalistic, reductive materialist approach, you could just say there's a sociological culture that has like a critical mass of a worldview. It doesn't have to sort of presuppose any sort of additional aspect of consciousness, because consciousness itself is very problematic. We really don't know. We can't really say anything conclusive about it at all. So
Yeah.
it's more of a collective, I would say more of a collective worldview, which is more, grounded, and you can really stand behind that. Yeah, there's a set of a collective worldview of people who are kind of fixed onto a set of metaphysical assumptions. And the thing is, those metaphysical assumptions, like the people who argue against sort of these other perspectives, are blind to their own metaphysical assumptions. And I think that's the thing that like upsets me in terms of like if they only knew how much bad philosophy they were doing by sort of holding tight onto like their assumptions that they really can't like argue like with any sort of 100% certainty. It's like when you dial down to like the core fabric of reality, things get really weird and you really don't know what's going on. And it's become so complicated, so interconnected. And like, is the wave function collapsing or is it not? Or like the ever many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics is literally saying because the mathematics says so, we have multiple realities that are creating in these instances that are parallel to our reality, but we can't see them, we can't falsify them. And we're going to believe that more than the fact that our consciousness is somehow interfacing with the quantum field and collapsing it, and that we have one universe that has an indeterministic aspect. It's like people want to believe that there's one fixed universe that's already existing and it's perfect and we have no free will and it's all deterministic. It's like, well, okay. Or we could have free will and we could have some sort of like choices that we're making. I should say not free will, some sort of intentional action and choices that we're going to make, because free will gets problematic. How much is our will connected to that?
I typically lean towards that not being existent at all, personally.
It's all
because if I make a decision that like under the same circumstances, I would have made that decision again a million times over, right? Like I'm a product of my environment. I grew up and
How do you know that though? How do you know?
well, I guess
How would you test
I
that?
don't know anything, right? But it seems to me
So
that
I just want to point out that that's an assumption you're making that you can't prove.
okay, fair enough.
So you cannot repeat something a million times. I mean, because the world around you changes, it evolves. It's an unfolding process. So there's a moment that's compressing right now that'll be different from the next moment, from the next
And
moment. from the next moment.
has it not been led into though from the one previous? Like if I tried to prove to you that I had free will by like taking my phone and throwing it across the room because I'm deciding to, god damn it, like I'm like have all of the conversations that I've had in my life and all of the experience in my life not led me up to this point where I've determined that I need to prove to you this thing by throwing my phone?
Until you have the source code to the fabric of reality for the entire universe, and you have like uh, there's one of these daemons that like is able to basically predict everything on every level. Like it's such a complicated interactive um, complex system that is so beyond being able to have a conceptual framework around that from one moment to the next. And how do you know that's the same? And it's the bottom line is that what you're suggesting has no way to prove it one way or the other. There's
Right.
no test you could do.
No, no.
And that's what makes it a philosophy question is we don't know. And so you have to kind of like pick a horse to ride on and like,
Mhm.
do you want to believe that we don't have any choices in the world and everything's already been figured out for us? Or do you want to live in a world where you have some enchanted relationship to how all this plays out and that you could do something about it?
Well, could
I
there
mean,
not
to
be
me,
liberation in both? Like, could I not find liberation in determinism and be like, well, you know what? Like, I can feel comfortable in the decisions that I make because I know that, I have gotten here as a result of a bunch of things and I'll learn whatever lesson I need to from that in order to get to the next place.
I don't know. For me, that just like leads to like, well, if it doesn't matter, it's all figured out, then what can I really do? And I just feel like that sort of
Complacency.
leads to some problematic moral like relationships because you're like, it's sort of like, well, it doesn't matter anyway. I'll just sort of like,
Not necessarily. I'm still on the quest, right? Like so far, I'm identifying with the deterministic perspective, and I'm still on the quest of trying to figure things out. And I'm still full of hope and wonder. Like, to me, there's no different when it comes to the experience. Like, it doesn't matter if I'm choosing or if it's deterministic. Ultimately, the experience shouldn't be impacted by the reality of either.
Well, I guess the bottom line is that some of these different perspectives can kind of lead you more in the direction of something like nihilism, where nothing really matters,
Right.
versus
It's
like
the slippery
having
slope.
some degree of hope means that, I don't know what that is, but that means that there's some way that you do think that your agency is having some impact in the world.
Well, I'll tell you what.
What is the hope?
I'm gonna get
What's
on the
that?
other I'm gonna get on the other horse because to me, like I said, there's not a big difference in the experience. And if by choosing the white horse, which is what I'm gonna call this one, the yes, we
Hope?
are choosing everything, the hope horse, that will inspire other people to do great things and prevent them from going down a nihilistic perspective, a slippery slope of darkness and destruction, then I think that that's good enough reason to find a way to identify with it.
Yeah, I mean that's the thing. I mean, you make an assumption, and it sort of may create a predisposition towards you that, for me, is very problematic. And I feel like there's a lot of people who are like super nihilistic and just like destroying the world and causing a lot of harm, uh, for whatever reason. They're just like for the lulls, just to get a
Mhm.
laugh out of it. Um, and it just, I don't know. For me, I just feel like there's a Alfred North Whitehead sort of has this ability where you have this a little bit of this reenchantment of, that we actually do have some sort of relationship, that everything isn't just figured out, that there's some sort of emotional vector
Right.
to reality where
I don't think those things are mutually exclusive. I don't think that determinism and like things being already decided is mutually exclusive with like a nihilistic perspective or like a negative perspective on things.
well, and all these things that I'm saying, there's no sort of proven causal relationship to
Right.
any of this. I mean,
Right.
it's just more of a center of gravity that sort of creates a strange attractor that's pulling you towards a specific outcome.
Which I can get on.
You
I
know,
can get behind that 100%.
By the way, real quick, Paradise Decay wants you to throw your phone, Alex. But this is, it's predetermined. There it goes.
What just
There it
happened?
goes.
Is
You know,
that
guys, really quick too. I was reading through chat, and there's some really good things in here, and there's one by John, if I can find it here, that I thought was absolutely great. John Westra says science is the part of philosophy's iceberg that's above the waterline of reality. I thought that was
yeah,
really good analogy.
yeah,
That
yeah.
sounds like a motivational poster I need to have hanging on the
Right?
wall.
Right?
Well, I think the philosophy. I mean, I think the thing that there's physicists who kind of really shit on philosophy, like Neil deGrasse Tyson and
Mhm.
Lawrence Krauss. These folks that just really disparage philosophy, but that actually science wouldn't exist with a lot of the philosophical development over all those years, and so
Right,
they're
right.
just really doing bad philosophy and being bad public intellectuals, and like like it's that, like, they're so sure that their metaphysical assumptions are right that they're going to like shame other people in believing anything else. So I don't know. You asked earlier about the liberation aspect. I think there's probably liberation in any sort of thing, any sort of perspective you take, and I think that's part of the philosophical journey, is to like
Mhm.
uncover all those and not to make a decision ahead of time as to what has merit or doesn't, and to really keep an open mind as to what you consider. And for me, as I do the podcast, I think I've experienced it from just talking to a wide range of different people from different perspectives and different backgrounds, and like constantly, I'm always like they're seeing stuff in differently. It's thing that I don't see, and I think it's like, for me, it's just recognizing that everybody has some piece of the puzzle. It's like that metaphor of
Mhm.
all these people with one hand on this elephant, and everybody's blind and they can't actually see the big picture, but we each have this little part, and it's like trying to like accumulate each of these little parts and like see if we can get the 60,000 foot view to be able to understand all of what this means and where it's going. Because if we can understand that, then we could, from my perspective at least, start to bend the arc towards justice, towards, getting people to be involved with projects or experiences that really help to change our consciousness in a positive way. Because with all of this stuff, the grand paradox with this virtual reality technology is that it's the the best of times and the worst of times. It's the most amazing, liberating, mind melding experience you could possibly have, but it's also the absolute worst surveillance technology that could turn us into
Mhm.
these like controlled uh, entities that are just serving the will of these mega tech corporations, that is further and further along, taking more and more of whatever agency we do have in this world away.
So
Uh,
I think we should go down that path a
Hmm.
little bit. But first, I think Skiva, you should give us a little bit more of this chat because that was pretty good. What else do you have?
Oh man, so yeah, there's a lot of good stuff going on in here. Someone just said, let me see, let me scroll here. They said, why not? Where is it? Why not both? Philosophical scientists and scientific philosophers unite. That was by Andrew Kissel, right? And that's exactly what has to happen. Everyone, right, needs to collaborate, and that's how things are figured out, and that's how problems get solved, and that's how we learn about everything.
Hmm.
yeah,
There's a lot of legends here in chat today. By the way, we got Andrea. I'm terrible
Oh,
at saying her name.
Andrea Ion Koshikoru.
Yes, yeah,
Hi.
yeah, yeah. Paradise Decay, Andrew Kissel, Danny Hunkley is here. We got Alt VR, which that another amazing philosophical guest that we've had here on the show. See what else we got. We got Delirium Drew is in the chat.
Danny Hunkley and
Yeah,
Fabster. What's up, dudes?
that Tom Clancy show, which is absolutely an amazing show. Yeah, just a lot of good stuff going on in chat here. There's a great, I want to rewatch this episode
yeah.
just to go through and see and be able to read in real time what everyone's saying, because it's some great conversation going on in here.
Skiba, you
So
had made a comment. I was going to make a comment, but then you read all those names, and I completely spaced out. What was the comment that you made before you read off all the names?
It was about
Oh, the philosophical
philosophical
scientists.
scientists and
Yeah,
scientific philosophers.
I just wanted to say that, yeah, we do need to have people that are doing both, and a good example is someone like Carlo Avelli, who I think has a deep respect for the philosophy. He's someone who's a quantum mechanic. He has the relational quantum mechanics as his interpretation of the quantum measurement problem, but he's also um, doing a lot of work in quantum loop gravity. But he wrote a book called The Order of Time. And if anybody who's interested in kind of this intersection between science and philosophy, I highly recommend checking it out, because I think he's somebody who's like has a deep respect for the philosophical process and doesn't just like really crap on it, and just
Hmm.
understands. He's actually very humble, and he comes up with different interpretations. He's like, look, this is my interpretation here for what the physics is saying. I'm going to leave it up to the philosophers to be able to kind of figure out the philosophy. I'm not going to like sort of go into areas that are like beyond where I should be really treading. And that's where like someone like Bernardo Castro picked that up and said, hey, actually, this relational quantum mechanics could actually create a framework for having a philosophy of mind of idealism, meaning like there's one cosmic mind that is kind of like this Platonic idealist approach. And, really anybody who's in analytic tradition of philosophy, they don't seriously consider idealism as a legitimate thing to even consider. They're just like, nah, that's just ridiculous. But I think there's a TED talk from David Chalmers about the nature of consciousness, and in that he makes the argument. He says, look, we need to have this like dialectical process, and so it's great that we have people like Daniel Dennett, who's taken a very extreme eliminative physicalist perspective on the nature of consciousness. That it's all just physical stuff and it's all just neurological correlates. But on the other side, you have these more radical ideas like panpsychism, which again goes back to someone like Alfred North Whitehead, who has the philosophy of organism and says, every single like photon or electron has some degree of consciousness, or, will to make some choice, or, some degree that as it sort of accumulates in some sort of fashion, the combination problem is a big problem with panpsychism. But you imagine all these little drops of consciousness sort of adding together in some mysterious fashion that then, is able to have that type of emergent, emergence of that consciousness. So the nature of consciousness as to whether or not it is emergent from this physicality, or if it's some sort of like fundamental field that's in another like uh, ontological reality, that we have like electrodynamics as an example. Like maybe it's similar to that. Like we have a whole framework that is its own thing. That's not. There's nothing that makes it. When it's fundamental, it's just like it's at the core baseline of reality. Meaning consciousness is integrated to every level of reality. That's what it means to say consciousness is fundamental. So in order to solve the problem of the hard problem of consciousness, which is what Chalmers has coined it, the hard problem. Daniel Dennett says there is no hard problem. It's just it's just emergent. What's the big deal? But
Right.
people
Chill.
that are like looking at this as a hard problem, then if you take it as fundamental, then it's like, well, okay, well maybe everything that's around us is like we're more akin to like antennas to that consciousness, or
Right.
it's like it's into the fabric of matter. It's each of these entities, these what Whitehead would call like these sort of organisms, these societies of each of these electrons that out of that becomes that little bit of consciousness. So, that's a little taste of both Carlo Rovelli in The Order of Time, but also the David Chalmers TED Talk that kind of starts to sort of map out where the philosophy is driving this neuroscience and this research into neuroscience.
You know what I would love to do if we can is because you talk a lot about Whitehead and you talk a lot about process philosophy. I would love to like maybe do some process philosophy like in action, and like
Yeah.
maybe like help us all to start to think this way, because maybe some of us do some of this already and don't know it and could be doing things better. It could be asking questions to ourselves or maybe coming at it from a perspective that would help us kind of dissect things. So maybe we can like pick something and kind of do some process philosophy together. And,
Okay.
together we can kind of get a better idea as to how we can all be philosophers.
It's a great
Sure.
idea.
I have a couple ideas. First, a disclaimer is that I rely upon a lot of the secondary literature, and I have an interview that I did with Matt Siegel about it was about a nearly 2 hour conversation about process philosophy, and so I have some calibration of being able to sort of understand. But Whitehead is notoriously difficult to read and understand the source material of process and philosophy. And part of it is because he was like one of the most genius mathematicians. Like he with Bertrand Russell, he tried to systematize all of mathematics into logic with the Principia Mathematica. And that Principia Mathematica is what Gödel was responding to in order to create the incompleteness theorem. And they wanted to really set the foundations of math onto logic, but that completely failed. And Gödel said, this is why that fails. You can be one or the other, consistent or complete, but you can't be both. So, but Whitehead then, as Matt Siegel told me, he's like, Bertrand Russell was like, he spent a lot of time trying to fix it. He still strived it. But for Whitehead, he was liberated. He was like, okay, well, I guess mathematics just has a certain intuitive element to it that we just can't formalize into logic. There's like this sort of, tuning into whatever is, what Whitehead talks a lot about is like this concrescence. And so if reality is all these little bits of experience, then what is it when you have a breakthrough? What is it when you have a turning point? What is it when you have a synchronicity and everything's just sort of aligns?
Hmm.
It's like these moments of concrescence that we have in our lives that we're like, oh, wow, well, this is all like coming to be. And it's almost like riding a wave. Like what the whole experience of being an artist and being a creative and being a maker in the world is how do you align yourself into your own personal concrescence and your own waves and what's happening in the wide world and what's happening with like the collective zeitgeist. How do you become in alignment with that so that you could always be in the deepest amount of flow state as you possibly can be? How do you know what you need to do moment to moment to be able to be the most engaged in what you are trying to bring into this moment of concrescence as you can? And so there's a little bit of like listening and intuition of like, okay, now it's time to do this. Now it's time to do this. It's like this deep of these flow states that you get. I think and VR really cultivates people into that state where you really dedicate into that mode of being. And I think when you think about a good VR experience, a good experiential, and this goes for designers as well. How do you try to create an experience for someone where you create the objective experience of a simulation of a VR piece that gets people to a state that is like this bliss, this flow state? The designers of Beat Saber, like they stumbled onto like a combination of all these things that seem to be pretty consistent. Like people who go in there are able to like have their consciousness and their experience modulated in a way that kind of reach this flow peak state of both challenge and movement and growth. I mean, it's like really quite remarkable. And so, what is it about all those different things that need to come together to be able to create that? You have to look at the whole thing. You have to look at the music. You have to look at the environment. You have to look at the sound effects. You have to look at all the different shaders and all the performance, and look at the puzzle aspect of, because there's things like audio shield and sound boxing, but
Mhm.
the real innovation with Beat Saber was that it was actually a hard puzzle. It was a puzzle that you had to solve with your body. And the thing
Mm,
is, if you just jumped into Beat Saber, your first run on Expert Plus, guess what? You're not going to solve it. You're going to have to like practice and play again and again. So, what is it about like coming back and doing that daily practice? And that, in a lot of ways, is that process philosophy is that this iterative process. You have to keep coming back. There's something
mm.
about when we go to sleep at night, all the lessons we learned from Beat Saber that day are kind of like integrated into our body. But we can't just like go in and do it. We have to like keep doing it. It's just like this iterative process. And so there's something about that unconscious learning that's so weird and magical. Like, and the thing is about Beat Saber is that you're expressing your will, you're taking action, but the way they got the scoring, somehow they figured out how to like put a number to it. So they're like, you know what? I'm getting better day after day. I'm getting better, and then next thing you know, you're on like Expert Plus, and you're like, how did that happen?
Seriously,
I'm not an
how did
expert
that
plus.
happen?
Hey, so Paradise Decay in chat has a great question, and I kind of want to know what you think about this too. Hopefully, my mic sounds better too. Let me know, guys. But he asks, what are Ken's thoughts on Sir James Gates finding error code found in the quantum fabric? And so James Gates is he's a quantum scientist, and he found in the math that describes superstring theory, right? He found error correcting code, like the code that is used in web browsers, and that's super interesting, right? In the fabric of reality. But of course, that's in describing quantum. I'm sorry, in describing superstring theory. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I haven't looked. I actually haven't looked into this at all. But I think it gets into a deeper question: is like, do we live in a simulation? Like,
Right.
is everything being written in some sort of code? And this error correcting code would, I have a degree in electrical engineering, and one of my electives that I took was a class in error correcting code. So, like, I
Oh,
did some of the math of that. But um, is that something that well, this gets to the question of like whether or not something like mathematics is invented or discovered. Is this
right.
something that's created by the human consciousness, or is it something that is there that just exists and that we discover it? Uh, and so I don't know. I tend to be a little bit more on the mathematical Platonist perspective, where I just like the idea of discovery because I think it's like it's more humble because it's like what, this wasn't created by man. There's a lot of stuff that we don't know, and we're discovering it. And I think actually when I talk to most mathematicians, they end up being a mathematical Platonist because I think part of it could be that it's a bit of a psychological trick to be like, don't get your ego so connected to thinking that you're the one who's figuring all this stuff out. You're just like finding something that's already there. And I think when you take the mindset of finding something that's already there, then it could kind of put you into that sort of state of humility that allows you to sort of find the thing in the first place.
Mhm.
So I kind of like that. I kind of like thinking that I'm discovering these things and that there's a deeper platonic realm of ideal
Yeah.
forms is out there. And that like part of that thing I was talking about earlier about coming into alignment with your own personal sort of unfolding with the collective unfolding, and how do you like bring those two things together so that you're like kind of kicking ass on all the different levels that you can. You're like living into the full potential of who you are and what you came here to be. Because at the end of the day, there's this fundamental question that everybody has to ask: who am I and why am I here? What's my purpose? What's my intention? And then, Whitehead has this kind of reinstalling this teleological teleological impulse. It's like this final cause. Aristotle had the final cause, which is like, what is the purpose of something like a table? The table's final purpose is like hold this, but for any given action, again, in any given moment, do you have a final cause? Do you have a purpose for why you're here? And and can you live into that? And when you do live into that, how do you know if you're doing the right thing and if you should be doing something else? But I think these are the types of questions that we all have to ask. Like, what are the things that I want to be doing, and how do I want to be contributing to the world? And how can I be as much as possible in alignment with what's happening in the world, so that I could sort of align what I want to do with what the world needs.
So is that like step one then to our process philosophy
Oh,
session here? Because you like said that it's kind of like as a disclaimer, it's kind of something that like you need to
oh,
keep it and keep doing, right?
yeah,
But everybody goes into the tutorial in Beat Saber and learns when to crouch and learns when to dodge the walls.
right. Yeah, let me get there's the other thing that I wanted to sort of, it's a little bit of a language trick. So John Cobb was a he wrote this book on Whitehead, and he had a whole um, book club about process and reality with Trip Fuller at the beginning of the quarantine. And I watched some of it. I still have to watch more of it and make my way through the process and reality. But he had this. So Whitehead talks about the subject predicate nature and how the language we use puts us into this mindset of substance metaphysics. It's just by default.
Mhm.
One of the things he said is that we say things like, "It is raining." So when you say it, what does that it refer to?
The state, the current state of life.
But it's the it. So what is the it?
It is raining. The sky, rain.
Is it the world? Is it the
Yeah,
universe? It's sort of like if you really interrogate that, it is raining. Like we don't even think about it. It's just part of our language. But it presupposes that there's an it there when it could just be raining. It's the state of raining, just like you
right,
said. Do
right.
you
Why
need
did we put that it?
Yeah.
We should just
Because
walk out
when you
and
say
be
the
like,
it, it's like, what is the boundary of the it? Is it where
right.
you're at? Is it the state you're in? Is somewhere else? Where's the boundary of that it? When you say it is raining, you assume that it's raining right outside of where you're at, but where's the boundary of that? That it is the way in which that subject metaphysics creates objects that don't exist, that don't need to
Mm,
exist.
right?
And,
Yeah,
and a lot
we
of
should change that. We should walk out and just say
raining.
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 Well, that's a lot of what the Chinese language does, actually, and I think that's part of why there's a bit of the Chinese philosophy that actually is maybe easier for them to sort of get into some of this stuff. It's like I think it's the Vorp Sapir hypothesis or something. It's something that was the thing that was covered in Arrival, where if you learn the language, then it sort of unlocks something in your brain to be able to experience the experience of time in a completely different way. But uh,
Language is so goddamn powerful, dude.
yeah,
It is
It,
so crazy how
it's
powerful it
powerful,
is.
but it's a cage. It's a prison that we're in because we can't describe anything outside of language, right? And I think there's a lot to be described outside of language, and it kind of sticks us in another box, right? We can't, we're slaves to what
Mhm.
we can describe, really.
well, and I think that's why Whitehead is so important, because he was like a super genius mathematician, and math itself, as shown by Frege, is like a form of a language. It's able to sort of spell out different relationships in a way that could be sort of considered a language. So for
Sure.
Whitehead, he was able to speak this complicated language that other people have, and so he was when quantum mechanics came along, he was like he understood like quantum relativity, or he understood Einsteinian's relativity like fairly quickly. So some of the focus that he was focused on was like mathematical physics, and so when there weren't a lot of people that really understood what the hell Einstein was talking about when he first came out, but Whitehead was one of the first. It was like, oh yeah, he was able to understand both the math and the physics in a way that he actually sort of reimagines certain aspects of that, relativity theory, like 10 years later, as as I
Hi,
talked
Mateo.
about. But there's a part when you imagine sort of coming across this quantum mechanics where the math is clear about what's happening, but the metaphors and the language and the story is like not clear. I think it was in response to some of that where Whitehead was like, you know what? Just like there's no it when it's raining, he's like, there's no it in physics. He's like, there's no it there. There's no substance. It's all just patterns of energy that are in relationship to each other. And when you get down to the core level, now this is again an open question in terms of physics, in terms of is it going to be the large scale relativistic perspective of Einstein, because it's incompatible with the quantum realm. So how do you mash these two things together? There's like a paradox there of how to match the macro with the micro. And there's a lot of people that are leaning towards more of this. Well, we should probably start with this, infinite dimension Hilbert space first, and then out of that come up with like this, pseudo Riemannian space-time that is coming out of that larger space. And so there's one mathematical structure that's feeding into the other one, and perhaps it's easier to go from one to the other, which means like the underlying fabric of reality is maybe more like the quantum realm than the sort of the relativistic world, which means that a lot of this work of like quantum loop gravity and what led Ravelli to also kind of take this more relational approach, where again he's like, yeah, there's no there. It's just patterns of energy in relationship to each other. And Bohm is another one who kind of has this implicate order and ways that there's this connection there. And so there's certain of these physicists that have these mathematical interpretations and of the quantum measurement problem. They have interpretations for what's actually happening and what it means, and it's in those interpretations where they have all these other metaphysical assumptions that kind of drive all these things. But to me, it's like someone like Whitehead, super genius math guy, speaking a language that I will never be able to speak as well he does. He came across this, and it actually has this bridge, the thing that's not only this bridge to like Eastern philosophy and Chinese philosophy, but for some, the amazing thing is that his interpretation of all this quantum mechanics stuff, who took it up? All these theologians, it's all these people who wanted to reimagine what God was, that have really been carrying the torch of Whitehead. Whitehead, this sort of super genius quantum mechanics guy, the whole trajectory of like analytic philosophy went in a completely different direction. And it's people like John Cobb and all these theologians who are like, doesn't have like this conception of God that's like this omniscient being. It's like, no, the God isn't the fundamental core. It's like creativity, and God is just a participant in this larger creative process that is unfolding around us. And to me, I just think that's so poetic, and to see how someone like Whitehead could like connect all of these different perspectives together, where we have all of these different worldviews that are so opposite that you can't like talk to each other.
Hmm.
So what's it mean to sort of have an interpretation that allows actually the Jewish and Muslim and Christians to be able to collaborate with each other? So there's something like there's aspects of Whitehead's philosophy and process philosophy. They're actually like doing this really radical like um, cross and creating kind of a secular but also inter-religious cooperation and collaboration that's happening. And it's like the deeper you dig into what's happening with process philosophy and like biology and quantum mechanics, and now I think arguably for experiential design and like the ways in which that what we're literally going into a process, we're going into an experience that has a beginning, middle, and end, and through that it's modulating our consciousness in some ways, and as we commit to it, we come out of it and it shifts our consciousness, and it has some impact. And it's to the degree that the FDA has created a whole new field of medicine called medical extended reality, which is that you could get prescribed an immersive experience that is therapeutic to the degree that's the same level or better than some medicine, which means that these experiences we're having are impacting our consciousness and our lives in this sort of ecological way that we don't really fully understand at a core philosophical level, but we know it works. And there's so many of these sort of philosophical implications that are yet to be fully fleshed out. And because Whitehead has been so difficult, one of the things that Matt Siegel said, he's like, there's plenty of philosophers that are like terribly difficult to understand, like Heidegger. But there's people that sort of have a group of people that spend the time to really figure it out and do the secondary literature and have these other ways of kind of explaining it, to really understanding it. I think that's we're at the very beginning phases of that happening with Whitehead. And it's going to, and Terence McKenna, actually, someone who's really into like psychedelics, he was super into Whitehead. So if you want to listen to someone who's like got the psychedelic take,
Hmm.
this ideas of concrescence. And so there's something about the psychedelic experience that when Terence McKenna saw, he's like, this is it. This is totally what I experience when I'm on tripping on like mushrooms or whatever
Hmm.
LSD. And there was something about Whitehead's philosophy that was like able to sort of describe everything from that psychedelic experience to like the religious experience to like all these nuances to these radical interpretations of relativity uh and quantum mechanics. And to me it's just terribly exciting because it's like just like VR was a very early nascent technology, and in some extent I was like an early adopter of seeing where this was going to go and like making a prediction. I'm sort of making similar predictions in terms of like the things I'm coming across and getting these deep intuitions of like, okay, there seems to be like this similar type of excitement around this type of philosophy and what's happening in these circles, um, versus what I saw the early days of VR, the early days of what I saw at the Magic Leap LeapCon in terms of AR. of the community coming together. When I went to the American Philosophical Association, I like ran into a number of people who had process philosophy orientation. There was like 1,200 people there, and I did 27 interviews. And there's not a statistical amount of people who are into process philosophy, but the people who I happened to collide with happened to be deeply into it. Uh, and so it was sort of another sort of signal to me that was like, wow, okay, this is some omen or some sign that there's something here that's really quite interesting. And the more that I dig into it, the more that's just like, wow, this is a deep well that has lots of really interesting stuff that's happening with it.
I love
Mhm.
me some Terrence McKenna. I just want to say that right now. Real quick, I don't want to derail us, but I do want to say that right now, for people that haven't been here since the beginning, and what's up to Steve Knows and Mateo and everyone that has recently joined us. There are only 29 people that are currently signed up for this Quest 2. So right now you have a 1 in 29 chance of winning. So everyone, that's less people than have been watching the show. So don't forget to hop down into the bearded Bard is here as well. What's up, buddy? So don't forget to hop down into the description and click on the Gleam giveaway and sign up for your biodata theft unit.
And if it's your first time here, subscribe to this channel.
Yes, please subscribe.
Earlier, Andrea asked when you were on the topic of math as a language. She said, if math is a language, then why can we and the universe speak it?
Oh, well, the relationship between math and the universe is one of the most profound open questions in all of the philosophy of math. Um, there's the Eugene Wigner, is like the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics. It's like it's like okay to be a little like on, but it's a little bit too on. It's like, what is happening here?
Mhm.
Um, you have something like the Pythagoras, who is like they're like all is number, like everything in the world is number, and everything goes back to number. And I think there's some influence of Pythagoras in like the more Platonic realm. I don't think that Plato necessarily goes as far as that, or maybe there's some influence and some sympathy there. But there's folks like oh gosh, which is Max Tegmark, who wrote a book called The Mathematical Universe, and he's got a little bit of that carrying forth that Pythagorean spirit that like all is number. Um, and again, like I really love talking to mathematicians because there's a lot of Platonists, and I feel like I'm at heart a Platonist in myself.
I know
Um,
I am.
yeah, and like some sort of ideal realm and some sort of interface between that, and it's the argument against Platonism, because there's a book that sort of goes through the Platonism and anti-Platonism. What is a valid solution, and the end result is like they're both valid because for one, they're not disprovable, but the problem that people who are anti-Platonists have is that if there are these abstract objects that are in this ideal realm and you're here not in that realm, how do you interface with them? How do you know that they're there? And to me, there's a bit of like, well, maybe consciousness is the interface, and we're somehow able to have our consciousness as the mediary. Or, I mean, this gets in sort of a more of a dualistic way of thinking about things, which dualism has so many problems that people don't really, you know, give it much credence because it's got so many issues with the mind body problem, and it's just has more problems than creates more problems than it solves. Let's just say that. But for me, I like to think of intuition, this deep sense of intuition. Like we get these intuitive hits that if there is some sort of like, let's assume that there's some sort of simulation and that there's this code that's unfolding and that there's some way that we can sort of tune into that and kind of know what's going to come and just sort of like be in alignment with where the wave is going to be. And we can kind of like sort of cut the corner and sort of ride the wave as it's coming, so that's sort of a metaphor we can think about. And we can sort of go to other traditions like Vedanta and other things like that. There's lots of other Eastern traditions that don't use the word of simulation, but it's essentially the same exact theory that there's this kind of platonic realm of ideal forms that are somehow we can tune into. So, what is it like? Is there some way that we can sort of tune into those forms and be able to like manifest them? And for me, the most clear evidence of that is math, because math is like it's people who are deeply into it, as talking earlier, the mathematicians, they sort of have that direct experience of that being in relationship to this thing that's larger than them, and they've just surrendered to it. And that the good mathematicians are able to sort of like tune in and come up with these innovations and figure stuff out. And that stuff they figure out, sometimes it's just a pure math that like has no application at all.
Hmm.
And sometimes they take this pure math innovation, add it to something else, and they come up with some sort of huge innovation and breakthrough. And so there's like this weird process of math where it's like all these branches that are off doing their own thing. And all of a sudden, people from across the aisle come together and they sort of like they're able to collaborate in a way like, oh, well, they get insight on this side and insight on that side. They come back and they're sort of able to sort of create new insights based upon these things that have just completely other reality bubbles. So to me, there is something that's like profoundly mysterious about math, the nature of math, the relationship to math, to reality. Uh, what is this relationship? And I'll tell you, I went to two math conferences a couple years ago, and just for full disclosure, I do the Voices of VR, but I could literally launch five other podcasts and have like a whole number of seasons with them. And so I have anywhere from like 80 to 90 interviews with mathematicians. I would go to this math conference, and I tell you, this is the hardest thing I've ever done. Go to a math conference with 6,000 mathematicians. I don't know uh, who these people are. I don't know what math they do. I can't even speak the math language. And I made it my goal to be able to go up to anybody and do an interview with them about whatever they did in math, which meant that I had to learn how to speak enough of the math concepts and ideas without fully being able to understand it, but to be able to kind of like become fluent in a language that I didn't speak.
Like what I'm doing right now with you.
Well, yeah, I mean, we sort of figure it out. You sort of take what you can know, and then you go back and you maybe listen to it over and over again. And that's the thing with philosophy is that you will get one little piece, and you go back and listen again. You just sort of again back to Whitehead. It's that iterative process of each time you're kind of peeling off one more aspect of the onion until you fully get to a moment of concrescence where you're like, I get it now. I can sort of move forward. But it was so hard. I had to do so much innovation for how I even conducted interviews. And it became much more about reading subtle body language cues and taking that as a symbolic omen for who I should be talking to, because it was like I was training myself to be able to like find the people who would be able to like I would be able to do this translation with. So anyway, like math as a language and just any of these domains, whether it's artificial intelligence or the decentralized web or philosophy or these more esoteric topics or VR, AR, whatever it is, like, there's a process of you needing to learn how to speak the language and speak the lingo, and immersing yourself into these worlds and being around people who are speaking that language and listening to it. But more than anything, learning how to speak it is for me, it's like the highest level of flow state of like accelerated learning I could possibly think is to be like go into an area, be super curious, have all these questions, be focused on that intentional field, focus on having serendipitous, unplanned collisions with people with that intention, and to see how that intentional field kind of like plays out through the course of the week of talking to different people. And to see how at the beginning of the week I had all these questions, and by the end I got a lot of these answers, and I didn't sort of schedule or plan anything out. I just surrendered to the process of being present and open to these connections, and to be focused on that inquiry, that question. And I think that when people do that, when they meditate on that inquiry, those questions, and I think it's why I love philosophy so much, is because it's almost like this process of like meditating on these deep questions, and then you'll come across something that gives you a bit of an answer, and you get what is a for me that experience of like riding that wave where you sort of one thing leads to the next, and this is what Jung called synchronicity. Synchronicity is literally this process of your internal your what's happening inside of you, your internal state, somehow having some sort of external manifestation of happening in the outside world, and there's an alignment there where your inside matches your outside reality, where you're just thinking about someone and then they call. That's an example.
Mhm.
Or you're thinking about a question, you really are trying to solve this question, and then you run into someone who just gives you the answer, or you stumble across it, or you accidentally find something on the internet, or stumble down a wormhole. I mean, there's so many ways that we can find those synchronistic moments. But for Jung is also a fascinating figure who was working with people like Wolfgang Pauli, who was one of the like premier uh, 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 quantum mechanics researchers, and it had this whole thing where it was the Pauli effect, where Wolfgang Pauli would walk into a room and all the physics equipment would break, and it would be like, what is happening? For him? He was like walking around and having all these like weird paranormal experiences, but he needed to have some depth psychological analysis with Jung, and he worked with Jung to be able to help him use his dreams to be able to do his science. And so he was like working with the imaginal archetypal realm to be able to actually like eventually like win the Nobel Prize for a lot of the stuff that he was doing in science. But it was Wolfgang Pauli, it was Pauli and Jung who came together, and they came together. They came up with this concept of synchronicity, which is trying to mash together this, in some ways, trying to add a little bit more of this enchanted aspect of reality, of the ways in which our consciousness and our reality sort of interface with the fabric of reality itself, and how can our internal state of whatever is happening inside of us, how can it like interface with the outside of us? And so Jung was doing all this really radical stuff with researching all of this, and his work, I think, over time, I mean, he actually wrote letters to Jung or to Freud about all this stuff. And Freud was like, you know what? You better like cut out all this esoteric crap. You're gonna like delegitimize everything that you're doing here, essentially. He was like, Freud was like, stop doing this. And then it kind of led to the break that Jung had with Freud. And Jung was like, no, I'm all into all this stuff. I'm like going all into like alchemy and astrology and all the shamanic practices. And he was the what just came out a few weeks ago was the Black Books, 1913 to like 1936 or 32, something like that. Like over 20 years of journals of what he would call this active imagination. He would sort of get himself into like this shamanic state of imagining all these different archetypal characters. And he said that, he took a lot of what was in the Black Book and put it into the Red Book. And a lot of what happened in the Red Book was the foundations of all of his sort of archetypal psychology and his whole theories of the unconscious that he came up with. And he was doing all sorts of he was reading stuff like the Chinese alchemy and the flower, a lot of books that were coming through, and the I Ching. He wrote the introduction to the I Ching. He was researching alchemy and astrology, and there's a lot of scholarship that's coming through. All the different esoteric stuff that Jung was doing is just now coming to light. But the stuff that was really interesting was this Black Book that has just come out. So all of these active imagination like journal entries for like over 20 years that has been a little bit like secret and not released has just been released. And so more and more of this stuff has been coming out. And there's people like Jordan Peterson who like are huge fans of Jung and have helped to some extent help popularize Jung. And so Jung, in a lot of ways, I would say there's like this Platonic return where people sort of getting more into the concept of Platonism. And I think Jung is on this bleeding edge. And over time, I think that Jung will be shown to some of the stuff that he was done where people would call him, crazy or whatnot, or Jung was really thinking he was going too far. Jung himself, he was like such on this deep thread of like discovering this stuff. He was like just writing and publishing. His collective works is just massive, and so he was untapping all these different natures of reality, the nature of consciousness, the nature of our unconscious, our shadows, shadow projection, all the stuff that is part of the depth psychological tradition, and that's starting to sort of slowly seep out now. And then as we move away from just the purely reductive materialistic approach, but trying to see these things in more of these ecological approaches. I mean, even the concept of the collective unconscious. But the thing is that Jung was looking at these symbols and these archetypes and how these archetypes play out through these dreams and through these experiences, and trying to translate those symbolic symbols into our experiences. So I think grounding this back to VR and philosophy, what would it mean to go into a VR experience that was able to then perhaps give us sort of a projective psychodrama of the archetypal dynamics that are unfolding in our life right then at that moment, where you would literally be able to go into a VR experience and come out of it knowing so much more about the dynamics of yourself. And I've started to see that with experiences like the Collider, which are at these film festival circuits where they create these scenarios where you invoke these different memories. You go in and you're asked to be able to say, think of a time when you had undue influence over somebody else, and then the other person has think of a time when you have had somebody else have undue influence over you, and you go into this space where you have this sort of psychodrama where you're able to puppeteer somebody. So you having control over somebody, you're literally controlling their movement, and you're reminded of all the memories you have of having too much power over somebody, and the person who's on the other side has experiences of having people have too much control over them. What's that bring up in yourself? And then having a conversation about that. Can you learn something about is the core essence of your character, the core essence of who you are, of your personality. As you go into VR and you come out, being able to sort of unlock these things that have been blocking you, and you suddenly are able to like do things that you were never able to do before. And I think that's the the part about our character and who we are as people, the possibility of going into these contexts that are stressing us and testing us. And the more that we test ourselves and see how we react in these different situations, the more we come out and we say, we realize, this is I reacted like this in this experience, in this experience. Maybe this is just a part of who I am, my core essence of my identity is that as we go through these different experiences, we come out of it like with this deep insight of who we are and why we're here. And I think if there's anything like that, to me, I can't think of anything more profound. If you imagine everybody in the world living completely into who they are and what they're here to do, with no people out of alignment at all. I mean, that's sort of for me like more of a thought experiment, as
Mhm.
more as a if we're actually get there. But what would that look like? What would that feel like? What would that be to live in a world that looked like that? And I think that for me, that's what philosophy opens up, is that type of like thought experiment and that type of these types of lines of thinking. And as I tell the story, what if that story I just told inspires someone to go out and actually make it? You know,
Right.
like that story I just told, this sort of imaginal potential is exactly what all of the greatest science fiction writers have been able to do. It's what Ivan Sutherland was able to do with writing The Ultimate Display in 1965 and coming up with the Sword of Damocles and the Mother All demos that happened in the same exact fall of 1968 computer conference, where the one demo that had the seed of everything that's happened since then. And Ivan Sutherland coming up with a augmented reality head-mounted display in 1968 when he created the Sketchpad in 1960. I mean, that guy was tuned into something profound.
Hmm.
That was like he was tuned into what was unfolding, and he's given us this gift, this seed that is now potentially able to like do all these things to unlock these potentials in us.
Do you see a utopian future for humanity?
Well, the honest truth is that it's a dialectic between you can't have a utopia without the dystopia. It can't live in
Exactly.
isolation. It's in relationship to it. And so, and I think that part of the you have to believe all truths and avoid all falsehoods aspect of epistemology is that it's like kind of a mutually exclusive. It's like the wave particle complementary nature of reality. You can't have both at the same time.
Right.
And so it's
But
actually
when we talk
they're
about a
dependent on
world
each other.
where there's a everyone in the world is like tuned in to who they are as a whole and they're all connecting with each other, when I think about what a world like that might look like, it starts to take the shape of some kind of utopian thing. But to your point, it couldn't possibly exist without some you know other aspect giving it that utopian vibe. So I'm sure something would suck. Like, what if it was the Facebook part of it that like went hand in hand with it, and while we were all becoming more connected with ourselves, somebody somewhere is finding a way to take advantage of that and making the world worse or something. You know what I
Well,
mean?
kind of like censorship in social media and YouTube and Google. I feel like that's a direct conflict of all of this, right? It's a way to. I feel like censorship is a way to control perception, which then controls the actions of the masses. And I guess that's kind of a little bit off maybe from what we were talking about it, but at
Well,
the
what
same
I
time.
would say is that with that sort of kind of mutually exclusive complementary nature of the wave particle, and the dystopia can't exist without the utopia, like they kind of depend on each other. I do think that there is a bit of how there's this pendulum that swings back and forth, and that's why Hegel came up with this sort of synthesis and antithesis, or the thesis, antithesis, and then synthesis, where there's like you go through the utopic, and then you like, oh well, you've reached the logical extreme. Now you sort of swing back towards the other way, and I feel like what we have right now is essentially like we're swinging pretty hard towards the dystopic potentials of all of reality right now. Like we're really needing a little bit of hope, a little bit of a vision for how all this could sort of turn
Mhm.
out. And one of the things that Jung gives with this as a dilemma is that when he calls it like the tension of the opposites, like an alchemical principle. We actually have to like sit with the possibility, and just as an example, where there's aspects where the anti-maskers have something right, and the people who believe in the science have something right. And it's not that each of them are completely wrong. is that they each have one aspect of the truth, but it's incomplete. And it's not complete until they're able to, what Jung would say, so sit in the tension of the opposites until the irreconcilable third is able to emerge. So you have to like sit in the paradox of like, you know what? I'm going to sit in the paradox of really listening to this anti-mask argument. And I'm going to give it a steel argument. I'm going to reflect back to them the strongest argument that I could give. And the strongest argument that I can give around that is that there's certain aspects of fear that we don't want to live into the fear. We want to live into the hope and the optimism, and that we can't just be surrendered to the fear. And that we also want to have some aspect of maintaining our personal liberties and having our liberties that are in right relationships. And also, we don't want to, just completely collapse the entire economy. So there's ways in which that we can't just shut down the economy. We can't just like escape into our fears. We have to somehow, and this is where Whitehead comes in again, be in relationship to the world around us and have a right relationship in more of a Buddhist context. And so what does it mean? And so the thing that the anti-masker is missing though is how their expression of their personal liberty is actually causing harm. And
Right.
it's actually potentially causing death because their expression of their liberty could actually be propagating the virus to the point where it's actually killing more people. So there's a moral aspect there where, whereas somebody who wants to sort of like have a way where we get the honest truth is that there's ways in which that the recommendations from the CDC were overly compensating because there's people who don't understand the contextual dimension that, oh, when they're inside then they actually really need it, but when they're outside in a wide open field then you don't need it because there's a low likelihood. But the lack of the ability to be able to differentiate the conditions under which it's the most likely to have transmission, which is indoors without a mask for long periods of time, and they refuse to wear a mask, they're literally putting lives at danger with their sort of so-called expression of personal liberties. But those
Hmm.
personal liberties are actually causing more harm than the benefit that's coming from the expression of those liberties. So it's sort of, you have to be able to like, all right, sit in the tension of the opposites until you sort of see how you transcend the limitations and include the best parts of that. So like if you're unwilling to transcend and include and sit in the paradox of the tension of the opposites, then you have these polar opposites of these different reality bubbles that are so far from each other where there's the Venn diagram, there's no overlap.
How do we fix that? Like, can we do anything?
I think that's the trick is sitting in the tension of the opposites.
Well,
And,
I can
and
sit in the tension of the opposites, but if I invite someone to sit in the tensions of the opposites with me and they just don't have it in them, like it's impossible. It takes two.
well, this is where the Socratic method and the sort of deliberative process, it does actually take that collaborative
Oh
process.
shit! Socrates got killed.
Well, the thing is that it really does take both sides. Even though people think that they can do that, is actually it's a lot harder because you do get fixed into like, no, this is what the science says, and sometimes there are cases where people get so far extreme that like to what degree do you extend your reality bubble to sort of enable a sort of uh, march towards fascism. This is the concern. The reality bubbles get so bifurcated to the point where the polarization becomes so extreme that you have a civil war that breaks out. And this is where I think Hegel comes into play because like this has all happened before. This is not like this is the first time that we've ever had this level of polarization. I mean, we look back into history to see that history is like this. The what Nietzsche called this the eternal return, where it keeps repeating and cycling. And so there's a monochronic and a polychronic. So the polychronic way of looking at it is like seeing this as a cycle that keeps unfolding and it's just repeating. And so how can we look to the past and learn from the past to see what what conditions were there, but also, you know, having that patience, like how much patience do you have somebody who's like in the back of your head, you're thinking, oh my God, what you're saying is literally killing people. And you think that you are trying to liberate people from some sort of, QAnon, conspiracy that is a thought control, people who are trying to use fear to control, manipulate people into some sort of anti-vax, world where it's just all about, a control. It's essentially
Mhm.
control. It's about a control. They are afraid of a big grand narrative that there's this control that's happening. And for me, there's an interview that I recently did with John Robb about this networked tribalism, where that really dives into this dynamic of where this is kind of headed. It's not headed in a good direction, but the antidote is sitting in the tension of the opposites and sitting with the paradox and knowing that the complementary nature of reality, and knowing that believing truths and avoiding falsehoods is a dialectical process that requires multiple people. Now, can you use logic to be able to argue that? I don't know. It could be that like the reality bubbles are so entrenched that I've been having these different debates on Facebook with folks, just who are steeped into this sort of anti-masking conspiracy and trying to find, is there some argument? And the argument that I gave, and I don't know if it'll work, but is essentially, it goes like this. If you're right, you're actually helping us in the long term liberate us from a really dangerous like place of fear and conspiracy where we're being controlled and we need to be liberated. So thank you for liberating us. But if you're wrong, you could actually be killing people. Like you're spreading misinformation. And so when I look at the weight of this, in the short term, there's more harm that's being done than in the long term. So I'm going to have an abundance of caution, even though I don't really know for sure. I'm going to have like sort of a epistemic humility where I don't know actually what's happening with any of this, but I'm going to have the epistemic humility and know that I'm going to trust these public health officials that are saying if we do these small things with wearing a mask and keep socially distanced, we just may find that we can get out of this. We have light at the end of the tunnel. And that if I follow what you say, you could actually be making this worse. And so from a utilitarian argument, which is essentially like a moral framework that says like, what decision do you make that is going to like minimize the harm that's done, or to sort of maximize the benefit or minimize the harm that's done to like the most people? Like being an anti-mask philosophy, not really knowing what the risks and the harms are, like that could actually be causing more harm. I don't know if that's an argument that would work for people, but that's the one that I came up with at least.
I think
go ahead, Skiba.
I think what we all need to learn here is the more everyone here stays in VR and the more everyone gets their friends into VR, the safer we'll all be. VR is the lifesaver.
I would caution against some sort of technological deterministic perspective, because that's sort of like VR as an empathy machine. Somebody, there's a lot of people who critique that. It's what's called the technological determinism. It's just like the VR is going to take care of it. The VR is not going to take care of it.
Right. It's kind of a joke.
You can't just
at the same time, you can't just spread COVID like through VR. Right. Right. But on a VR podcast, I'm going to say that if you go into VR, you're not going to spread COVID. So that is.
No, what you're saying is correct. I guess I thought you were making a different argument, which is that if everybody gets VR, they'll somehow come to the conclusion.
Right.
I don't think but you are right that if you socially distance through VR, you have a 0% chance.
Right. And is it actually social distancing, right? Because you're going into these places and you're having face-to-face conversations with people. But your physical bodies, these bodies in what we think is base reality, we're not close to each other, but we are. Our energies are actually close to each other by being in VR together and being able to share experiences and hang out and do all this stuff. And it's safe. It's the safest way we have right now.
Yeah, and just to throw out there that it was a few weeks after the social distancing was just trying to take off and popularize that the CDC came out and said, no, let's use physically distancing instead. But it's sort of an unfortunate part of trying, that may be part of the confusion of people like, oh, no, I'm not going to be socially distanced. I want to have my Thanksgiving, It's like, but you really need to be like physically distanced. So yeah, but in VR, you are physically distanced, but you are not socially distanced. You're intimately connected.
So was this mask thing kind of like some Kent by process philosophy in action? Like using the way you think as a tool to come to a conclusion in this debate?
Well, it's sort of the Jung. It's to some extent Hegel and Jung and a whole line of people that have sort of process thinking sort of embedded into some of their thought. I think Jung is someone who has a lot of process orientation, and it's this alchemical principle of sitting in the tension of the opposites. And it's actually an interview I did with Marilyn Schlitz from the Institute of Noetic Sciences, and she is somebody who, they do a lot of frontier research into consciousness and the nature of consciousness itself. And they end up doing things that are looking at psychic phenomena that is not in favor or in vogue for anybody who is a materialist or a physicalist. It's just, it's not possible to reconcile psychophenomena in a physicalist naturalist worldview. So people like Marilyn Schlitz, they are, you think about in the Kuhnian perspective, they're sort of anomalies, and they're out there exploring all the anomalies, the paranormal explorers, and UFOs and paranormal and the psychic phenomena, all the consciousness researchers, and their whole sort of what in some circles is called fringe science. I prefer the term frontier science because they're still doing science. It's just it's frontier. It's just on the bleeding edge. They're like testing hypotheses that people think are ridiculous, but they may think, like they've done research to say like that consciousness is actually the thing that is collapsing the wave function. It's the Wigner von Neumann interpretation of quantum mechanics, which if you watch devs, they actually give a call out to the Wigner von Neumann. And there's actually the guy who's a determinist is really angry because he's like, no, that is not, because it's essentially what the Wigner von Neumann interpretation of quantum mechanics is that it's actually our consciousness that is somehow interfacing with the wave function and collapsing it through our perception. So, there's ways that you can test that, and they have been testing it. But so I've done interviews with Dean Radin and Marilyn Schlitz, and there are these frontier scientists, and but all the people I talk to, they know the more about the philosophy of science than anybody else. It's the people like Rupert Sheldrake and Dean Radin and Marilyn Schlitz, people who are like have these concepts and ideas that kind of deviate from the mainstream. They're the ones who understand the dynamics of the philosophy of science and the sort of bias, the sociological biases of people having collective worldview. Like we were talking about before, the paradigm shifts. People have a paradigm. They don't want to let go of it. And it's like fixed. And this is something that John Robb actually talked about in terms of the consensus and alignment. So, or the consensus and the dissent. So any healthy perspective has people are able to agree on things, right? But if you have too many people agree for too long, it becomes stagnant, and you don't have the ability to be able to grow and evolve. So you need to have the people who are on the the iconoclast, the people on the outside, the people who are thinking differently, people who are challenging the status quo, and they're trying to like liberate this stagnation that happens. And that's the essence of the scientific process. That's what Kuhn showed, and the structure of scientific revolutions. That all the revolutions happened with those sort of revolutionary people who dared to go against like the paradigm, and they were like, no, I actually think Copernicus is like, I think the sun's actually in the center. It's not it's not the Earth that's in the center. All these sort of anomalies with the epicycles of like these retrograde cycles that weren't quite working out. Like the math wasn't working. They had to add epicycles on top of epicycles on top of epicycles. It was like all these fixes, and it's like dark matter and dark energy could be one of those like fixes that we're trying to like make the math work out by inventing things we never actually observed. So there could be things like that we have in our mainstream paradigm that it just like are not parsimonious. There's no, it needs to have this disruption. So there's this flow between the consensus and the alignment and the breaking apart and sort of reconstituent and sort of growing and evolving and sort of transcending and including those and being able to have new models that incorporate more of those anomalies. And that's the essence of the paradigm shifts, is that this never ending process that's happening. And I think that that's for me what I think VR fits, is that we're in a vast need of like there's a stagnation in the culture, and like VR comes in and like disrupts it. It's like giving us a whole new, sounds like this digital psychedelic that's like opening up people's minds in terms of like what even the nature of reality is. And it's like it's sort of shifting them out of this existing mode of being. And for me, the exciting thing is like as we get more and more people that are into this new mode of being, then what are the underlying metaphysical assumptions that provide a strong foundation into a whole new worldview? And for me, that's like folks like Whitehead and Bergson and Deleuze, and there's a whole line of philosophers that if you look at institutions like the California Integral Institute, Pacifica Institute, these are the graduate institutes that are on the bleeding edge of like integrating all of these like psychedelic perspectives and philosophies. And there's the mainstream analytic tradition of the American Philosophical Association, and there's quite a bit of stagnation that happens there with people that are, again, there's a groupthink that happens. And sociologically, I experienced it, and I've been into people that are in a philosophical traditions that are more, either continental or have process philosophy, process relational orientations, or Eastern philosophy, Chinese philosophy, more Hermetic philosophies, Neoplatonism, Platonists, all these people who are kind of on the outside of that mainstream are all having like, they have clues, they all have like insights to give to be able to like shift us forward because we're in this huge state of stagnation. Um, so yeah, when you think about that, it's like there's truth there. Like this, I think there's a thing that Ken Wilber said. He says nobody's smart enough to be wrong 100% of the time, and I love that because it's like no matter how wrong they may be about the mask, they still have some truth. They may like they're revealing something that may be a blind spot, and there could be aspects of that blind spot that I'm shadow projecting on them. They're like,
Even a broken clock is right twice a day.
yeah. So yeah, it's sort of like really having that like I said, like I'm an aspiring philosopher. I'm like sort of striving towards this state. Like, what does it mean to be acknowledged to the philosophical community as being a philosopher? What does it mean to do philosophy? And having that epistemic humility of like it's the
I
Dunning.
know I do not know. I know nothing, right?
Yeah,
That's Socrates.
it's the Dunning Kruger. You come into something new. You're like, oh my god, I'm an expert. And you do all these blog posts, and then eventually you turn to this point where you're like, oh shit, there's so much I don't know about this. And I think I reached that with philosophy. It's like, oh, there's like a lot of stuff that like I'm sort of hitting above my weight here. I may like be speaking about that stuff, but like be able to like quote the source material and to be able to do my own readings and do my own interpretations. Like I'm doing this like meta layer of telling the story of philosophy, but to like actually do the philosophy is something that like
Well, I feel like all the true masters always feel that way, right? Like even like the world's best guitar player knows that he's not even close, like he's never going to actually master the guitar. It's like one of those things where it's like you kind of just have to let the community decide, and like whatever they say is they said it, not you. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
yeah.
I am curious, Ken, are you afraid of death? Does it keep you up at night?
I'd like to say no, but I think there's a big part of me yeah. Um,
Do you think that your philosophical journey and a fear of death are like co-writers? Because I know they are for me. Or there's at least it stemmed from that. I remember as a kid being very young and realizing that I was going to die, like truly realizing it, way younger than I think most people probably do. And having that realization like shocked me to my core. And I think by having that realization, it kind of like pushed me into pursuing philosophy as a way to like answer some of those questions and so I could sleep at night.
yeah, I just want to sort of name that. I just as you asked that, I just had a lot of emotion that came up in that, and part of it is that when I first got into VR, I was still with my wife, Jen Gouvet, and I eventually came to the point where I had decided that I wanted to leave the relationship, but there's a situation where she was saying, "If you ever leave, I'm going to kill myself." And I don't know how to like describe that like process of like what that was like, but I left and she took her own life. And it was almost like this, like I had this vision of like wanting to live into this potential of traveling the world, having these conversations with these people. Like it was almost like there's a moth story called Alternative Ithaca, Tom, I think. And in the story, Tom tells a story of how he was this mystic going from place to place, and he goes to Ithaca and he gets this vision of of this life where he's a father and he's just in a completely another world where he's like He's a professor and has a family, and it felt so real to him that this was her life. And so there's a part where I had this vision of this dream of a life that I wanted to live into. And in order to get there, I had to leave my wife, who ended up taking her own life, and she committed suicide. And so, yeah, there's this part of, as you ask that question, that taps me into this. Like, I made a pact with myself that I would do everything that I could to be able to live into this vision that I had of what I wanted to be and what I wanted to do. And, and the truth of the matter is that it's, the way that I'm doing is not necessarily even sustainable in terms of getting all the support that I need. And the thing that I had mentioned earlier about the collider, about how, um, with the collider, there was this moment of having power over someone, and someone having power over you. They asked me to have this, to recall this memory of having undue power over someone.
Mm.
And what came to mind was standing on the sidewalk, telling with my wife that I was going to leave, and she was holding our dog at the time, pleading for her life, literally pleading for her life, that she's not going to be able to live without me, and that if I leave, she's going to take her life. And so I'm in this VR experience, and that's what comes up. And so for me, what's it mean to have power over people when it's a life or death situation? So what have I done? Well, I try to do everything by myself. And it's like, I don't ask for help. And it's it creates a situation where it's like a spell that I create for myself, where you asking that and me saying that is actually me trying to break that spell and feel the reality of that moment. Um, because it's a thing that haunts me, of like, to not like get the support that I need from the Patreon, to not have enough people donate, to not like be willing to say, hey, this is really hard. It's not been easy to do what I've been doing, and at great cost to my own savings. Honestly, it's like at a point it's not sustainable, and it's like, but the thing that catches me up is the unwillingness to be able to ask for help and to say, "Hey, I need some help. I can't do this alone." As much as I talk about all this process, relational physics, philosophy around being in relationship, I'm not in relationship. I have all these sort of like demons inside of me, and I think, like, it's like my fear that I like die and I have all of this work that I've collected and it hasn't gotten out into the world, and it hasn't like done the full extent of what I know, the stuff that I've gathered. And this conversation is like a liberation of, like, all this stuff that I've been sort of like squirreling away years and years and years, and like hundreds and hundreds, literally over 1,000 podcasts that are unpublished, that I just need help of like getting support, people to like, to pay and to find some way to be in dialogue with people in the audience. And for me, it's like such a relief to be driven by all of these concepts and these ideas. And you know, but again, that having power over someone else, my experience of that is that it's a matter of life and death. And you know, so yeah. Thanks for the question. Thanks for um yeah,
Well,
just bearing witness to that.
our condolences here, obviously, and as you can see in the chat, everyone was very moved and touched by your story as well.
Thank you, dude.
Thank
Thank you so much for keeping it real, brother. Like, we're talking about some shit here, and like,
Yeah.
when we talk about what's real and what's not real, and a lot of those conversations revolve around these like intangible things, these paradoxical ideas, these feelings, and this human experience. This kind of stuff gets kicked up, and it's just it's an honor that you would share something like that with us, man. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I just want to just invoke her name, Jen's name, Jen Gouvet, and then, as well as her father, Dan Gouvet, who took his own life when we were living with him. as well as my aunt, um, Astrid Hinkles, who also had taken her life. So it's something that since then I've gone on and remarried and am living a very happy life. But at the same time, there are, as we talk about young, we're talking about young, and we talk about the shadow. This is a part of my shadow. This is a part of, part of me railing against Facebook and all this stuff and surveillance capitalism. Well, guess what? I'm not a very good capitalist. I'm just like, it's a part of my own shadow. And there's a ways in which that, the more that I realize that, the more that I sort of rail against these entities, that they become a, a vessel for my shadow projection of the things that's really about my own shit that I need to figure out, and not to just like project this shit onto other people, but to figure out how to like to own that, to say, you know what, like I have a hard time figuring out how to survive as a good capitalist, as someone who's just trying to be in right relationship with the community around them. I have so much anger around capitalism and all the evils and everything else, surveillance capitalism, that I denounce all of it and try to live as a pauper. But yet it sort of it becomes a part of that unconscious shadow that in the end of the day blocks me. And I don't know. There's something about this live podcast that's being live streamed on the internet and archived on YouTube that sort of makes it like we're talking about that concrescence, like for whatever reason, there's this moment of concrescence of all the stuff that's been building up to this moment where for you asking that question, are you afraid to die? It turns out the answer is yes, I am. I
Yeah.
am afraid to die. I'm afraid of not, I want to leave a legacy behind. I want to leave enough breadcrumb trails for people to sort of like help navigate the future, so that like you can think about the future generations that we have and think about that 7 generations and what's it mean to like really be in relationship to those imaginal future, like I'm an ancestor to those people that are going to be in the future, and what's it mean to
Mhm.
be in right relationship to them, and what can we do now to be able to build a world that is going to be a lot better than what it is now. And I think a lot about that. I think, day in, day in, I constantly tell myself, I was like, people are going to be a lot more interested in the work that I'm doing now, 100 years from now, than, people probably even realize what I'm doing right now, and all
Hmm.
the stuff that I'm doing. And it's sort of like I live in that future. I live into that, like trying to be in that right relationship. But then by doing that, I'm not in the present, and I'm not facing the the traumas and the reality of what each of us need to face. And I think if anything of what VR and all these processes can do, conversations like this, it doesn't have to be a VR. It just could be the right question at the right moment. It could be the right experience. But what would it be like if we could we could contain all of that depth psychological process where you could have an experience and you walk out of it feeling liberated from your shadow that you've been projecting onto the world that's been blocking you for your entire life.
I think the people here in chat um, may have an understanding of how life changing and world changing spatial computing is going to be, and it's at this very moment it's a very small thing, but 20, 30, 100 years from now it's going to be huge. It's going to be absolutely huge. And I think people are going to look back at your work for a very, very long time, and all of the interviews and all of everything you've put together and the breadcrumb trail that you did leave. And I think it's going to be, I think it's going to make a huge, huge impact, bigger than it has already. And I hope that is somehow comforting to you.
Well, and by
So,
coming on this show too, like you're helping us to help you, like
Yeah. Yeah.
you definitely have a strong community behind you who believes in everything that you're doing. And I guarantee you could build an army overnight if you needed to, dude. You know what I mean? So
Well, I think
we're
the thing
strong
is,
believers.
yeah, I think the thing that I want to sort of come back to is that all of the barriers are within myself, and finding ways that not being in communication with my Patreon, having things with like I get locked out of my Patreon for months sometimes because it's like there's some glitches. There's like all these things that like conspire to like um that become too much for me to deal with, and I just progress on, and sort of it becomes like baggage in your closet that you don't want to look at, or stuff that you shove down in the basement, and you don't sort of clean the Jordan Peterson clean your room. Like this is a metaphoric, like to sort of a cleaning of being in right relationship to all these things. And
Mhm.
I think there's something about being curious and asking questions, and just for you, like that's what I do all the time. I ask people questions and sort of able to invoke these different conversations. And I think that there's a level which I feel matched by a similar level of curiosity and inquiry, and this conversation here, to be able to sort of like surrender into that line of inquiry, and to be like, okay, I'm here to answer whatever you want to know, and
Mhm.
I'll sort of be present, and and to be present to whatever arises, and for me to just say, hey, you know what, I'm feeling a lot of emotion right now, let me just sort of sit with that, because that there's something that wants to that's working through me.
Fucking thank you, bro. Like, thank you for letting that happen, man, because it was it was beautiful for you to go through that, but also like sharing that is has its own benefits, like
Mhm.
it can also show people that it's okay to like feel things and like like and sit with it for a minute, right, and just like work through stuff, because it's so easy to like fight that inclination to like
Mhm.
dive deep into the emotion or deep into that thought process that maybe scares you, you know what I mean? But it's okay, and together we can help each other get through all of it.
Yeah, and it's almost like all of this philosophy becomes a shield to kind of like protect me to the just the horror that's happening in our world right now. I mean, it's like just tune into what's happening on the earth, to the earth, and what's happening here in the United States. It's like it's heartbreaking, and just to like listen, just to like pause and be like, you know what,
Hmm.
just to breathe into it, and just to think of all the people who are really suffering right now, and how much the earth is suffering. And I just want to fight so hard to be like, I have some sense of maybe here's some directions that we can go in to figure some of this stuff out. But I think everybody's going to have their own journey for what's going to take for them. What and I may have a cathartic release here, but the work's not done. This is like endless. This is like
Yeah.
like
Right.
all right, now I'm cured. Thanks, guys. Ready to like go take off now. Yeah, no, it's just like just one step. And I think for each of us, we're all on our journeys of trying to figure this out. We're trying to be in alignment with what our values are, living in a world that's really fucked up with everything, and just driving towards all this centralization and closed walled gardens and monopoly, greed, control, and this substance. Some of the substance metaphysics is the illusion that you're an individual and absent of being in relationship to the world around you. And I think that's the biggest disease, is like not being in relationship to the world around you, and like thinking that you're just alone, and that it's just all about your rights and your responsibilities, and your liberties that you need to have expressed. But no, yeah, there's a part of that that's true, but it's also we are deeply in relation to everything around us, and those actions are having rippling out.
Yeah,
Um,
ego.
so
Maybe ego is our biggest barrier in life to truly connect with others and in the planet that we live on and everything here.
yeah,
So
yeah.
we are 2 hours and 20 minutes in here. Do we?
I feel like we should stop at the peak. I
Yeah,
think
Yeah,
we've had a concrescence. Everything
yeah,
that's come out is going to come out, and when we
exactly,
go, it's just gonna, we did it.
exactly.
It's it.
Fucking Kent, bye, ladies and gentlemen. Thank
and
you,
bye.
dude. You are the
Thank you.
man. You're inspiring to all of us. Like, I'm just trying to think like you. I don't know if I've made that obvious yet, but like, if you could just tell me how I can think like you, that would be great. You know what I mean? So, thank
Yeah.
you so much, brother. You are the man, and we will see you in season 3.
Yes,
Okay.
everyone, go down here on the monitor right below me, and you will see ways to follow Kent. You'll also find clickable links in the description, and you can check out his work. You can support him via Patreon. Anything you can do. Great minds are so hard to come by these days, and Kent is one of them, and we're just honored to have him here on the show. Thank you, Kent, for being here, and thanks for keeping it real. Heart's with you,
Awesome.
man. For real.
Yeah, and I just want to send out this intentional field that we created here out into the world, and may it ripple out. And if it's able to get into the ears of some of these people, that if it changes their one person's mind, that's great. That's a victory. And yeah, just thank you so much for just holding this space and inviting me on. And yeah, and we'll see where this all goes, and may we all live into our deepest potential of when I think about the ultimate potential, it's becoming more connected to ourselves, connecting to other people, connected to the world, and connected to all realms of reality. It's all in relationship to self, other, the world, and all of the cosmic dimensions of all of the realities. And so, if we can just sort of like remember to find ways to be connected more to ourselves, to others, to the world, and to the earth that we're on. And that would be my intention and leaving thought as we sort of wrap everything up here. So thank you so much.
Kent,
Thank you.
bye, ladies and gentlemen. See you next time, sir.
See you, Kent. We're going to eject you here and finish up our show.
We're going to wrap it up super quick because I'm right there with him. I feel like we've pretty much done it. We're giving away a Quest 2. It's in the description below. We love you all so very much. Thank you for joining us.
And real quick, remember next week, as you see down here in the show, the guest will be our community. So we
haven't said this yet. We're announcing this right now. Actually, you are our guest next week. That's right. You. We want to have like a call-in style format for our season finale next week, day after Thanksgiving, where if you are interested in joining this conversation with us, there is a form that you can fill out on our Discord right now with the link below to our Discord. Fill it out, send one of us a DM, and we are going to schedule it out. And anyone who wants to be on the show next week is more than welcome to come be on it. Boom, we'll put you on the monitor. You can give a plug, you can do a shout out, you can ask a question, whatever you want to do, but we want to see you on this show with us next week.
Absolutely. And really we're show is what it is because of the people who watch it and listen to it. And we do want to hear your voice. Your voice is very important, just as important to us and to the world. So please take us up on this offer and come on over. Next week will be our final show of season 2. We will be back a month after that. I think on New Year's Day, right? And we'll be ready to rock it with some more amazing guests, some more improvements, that we're working on. So, man, we're just so happy that you guys are along on this ride with us.
We really are. Share the shit out of this podcast with all of your friends. We will see you next week. Take care, everybody.
Bye-bye.